Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world where the simple act of waking up on a winter morning could be a test of your will to survive. Imagine this. It is January, somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, the year is 1832, and you open your eyes to find frost crystals forming on the inside of your bedroom wall. Your breath hangs in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. The water pitcher on your nightstand has frozen solid overnight, and you can no longer feel your nose. Welcome to winter in 19th century America, where central heating is a fantasy, insulation is a word that does not yet exist in any practical sense, and your odds of making it to spring depend entirely on your preparation, your stubbornness, and a fair amount of luck. You probably would not survive a single week of what these people endured for months on end, and honestly neither would I. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love knowing that people from completely different time zones are drifting off to the same stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the doorway of a small cabin somewhere in the American Northeast. The year does not matter too precisely. Let us say it is the 1820s or 30s, though the experience would have been remarkably similar throughout most of the 19th century. The snow outside has piled up past your windowsills, and the wind has been howling for 3 days straight. You have not seen another human being besides your immediate family in nearly 2 weeks, and the nearest town is an 8-mile walk through drifts that could swallow you up to your waist. This is not a vacation. This is not a charming historical reenactment. This is simply life. And the question hanging over everything you do is brutally simple. Will you and everyone you love make it through until the thaw? The winters of 19th century America were not just cold. They were a comprehensive assault on human existence that tested every aspect of daily life. Historians still argue whether the early 1800s experienced a particularly brutal stretch of climate compared to later decades, with some pointing to the lingering effects of volcanic eruptions and the so-called Little Ice Age that gripped the Northern Hemisphere for centuries. What we know for certain is that average winter temperatures in New England and the upper Midwest regularly plunged well below 0 Fahrenheit for extended periods, and the infrastructure to combat this cold was, by modern standards, almost laughably inadequate. You have to understand something fundamental about this era. There was no safety net, no government heating assistance, no emergency shelters, no insulated walls filled with modern materials designed to trap warmth. If you could not keep yourself warm through your own labour, ingenuity and advanced preparation, you simply suffered, and suffering in the cold has consequences. Fingers and toes turned black from frostbite, lungs filled with fluid from pneumonia, infants who could not regulate their own body temperature slipped away in the night. The mortality rates during winter months spiked dramatically, particularly among the very young, the very old, and anyone whose circumstances left them without adequate resources. And yet people survived. Millions of them, year after year, generation after generation. They developed strategies, traditions, and technologies that allowed them to push back against the killing cold just enough to endure. Tonight you are going to learn exactly how they did it, every uncomfortable, ingenious, sometimes disgusting detail of winter survival in an age before thermostats and electric blankets. Picture yourself waking up on that frozen January morning. The fire in your cabin's hearth has died down to embers overnight because despite your best efforts, no one stayed awake to feed it through the darkest hours. The room temperature has dropped to somewhere around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which might sound almost tolerable until you realise that you need to leave your bed, and your bed is currently the only warm place in your entire world. The blankets piled on top of you weigh nearly 20 pounds, a combination of wool, quilted cotton, and perhaps a feather comforter if your family has the means. Your body heat has created a tiny microclimate beneath those layers, and the thought of abandoning it feels like a form of self-punishment. But abandon it you must, because the fire needs feeding, the animals need tending, and life on a 19th century homestead does not pause for comfort. You swing your legs out of bed and your feet hit the wooden floorboards, which feel like slabs of ice. If you are fortunate, someone has left your shoes near the dying fire overnight to keep them from freezing stiff. If you're less fortunate, you spend the first several minutes of your day forcing your feet into leather that has hardened like armour. Either way, your first task is clear. Get that fire roaring again before everything else becomes impossible. Here is a quirky detail that might surprise you. Many families in this era kept a small pile of kindling directly under their beds, not out of laziness, but out of genuine survival strategy. Having dry, easily combustible material within arm's reach meant you could start rebuilding the fire without having to cross a frozen room to gather supplies. Some households even kept a small container of live coals banked in ash overnight, a carefully managed ember that could be coaxed back to life with minimal effort come morning. This practice required skill and caution, because a mishandled coal container could mean the difference between a warm breakfast and a house fire that left you homeless in a blizzard. The cold of those mornings was not just uncomfortable, it was a presence, almost a personality, something that seeped into every crack and crevice of existence. You could see your breath indoors. You could watch ice form on the inside of windows that were, in many cases, made of single panes of glass so thin they might as well have been open to the outside air. If you lived in a particularly humble dwelling, and most Americans of this era did, your walls might be nothing more than logs with mud or clay packed into the gaps, insulation that shifted, cracked, and deteriorated over time. The wind did not knock politely before entering your home. It forced its way through every weakness in your structure, and there were many weaknesses to exploit. You might think that people of this era simply accepted the cold as an unavoidable fact of life, and in some ways you would be right. There was no expectation of the kind of climate-controlled comfort we take for granted today, but that does not mean people were passive in the face of winter's assault. They fought back with every tool available to them, and their ingenuity in the face of such primitive conditions is genuinely impressive. They understood their enemy intimately, knew its patterns, its tricks, its most dangerous manifestations, and they organised their entire lives around defeating it, or at least surviving it. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, surrounded by walls that actually keep the cold out, heated by systems that require nothing more from you than adjusting a dial, you're going to travel back to a time when none of that existed. You're going to learn what it really took to make it through an American winter in the 1800s, and along the way, you might just develop a new appreciation for the thermostat on your wall and the ancestors who never had such luxury. Take a deep breath, feel the warmth of your blankets, and let's continue forward into the frozen past, where your next challenge awaits, understanding exactly what kind of structure stood between you and the killing cold outside. The cabin you call home is not much to look at, and if you are being honest with yourself, it is not much to live in either. From the outside, it appears as a humble rectangle of stacked logs, a stone chimney rising from one end, a single door and perhaps two small windows covered with oiled paper or, if you're lucky, actual glass. The roof is made of wooden shingles that have seen better days, and the whole structure settles into the landscape like something that grew there rather than something that was built. It looks quaint in that way historical paintings make everything look quaint. It is also, in practical terms, a drafty death trap that barely qualifies as shelter. You need to understand what you are working with here. The typical frontier cabin of the 1800s was constructed using techniques that prioritize speed and available materials over anything resembling thermal efficiency. A family moving into new territory might throw up a basic log structure in a matter of weeks, sometimes days if enough neighbours pitched in to help. The logs themselves were often green wood, freshly cut and not properly seasoned, which meant they would shrink and warp over time, opening gaps between the courses that had been carefully fitted together during construction. Those gaps were your enemy, and the wind knew about every single one of them. The standard approach to sealing those gaps was called chinking and daubing. Chinking involved stuffing the spaces between logs with whatever materials were available. Stones, wood chips, moss, straw, even old rags. Daubing meant coating those stuffed gaps with a plaster-like mixture, typically mud combined with clay, animal hair or lime if you could get it. The result was a wall that looked solid enough from a distance but revealed its weaknesses the moment winter arrived in earnest. The daubing cracked, the chinking shifted, the wind found its way through, carrying cold air directly into your living space, as if the walls were nothing more than a suggestion. And here is a fun detail that speaks to the desperation of the situation. Many families rechinking their homes became an annual autumn ritual, right up there with slaughtering the hog and putting up preserves. You would go around the entire structure, inside and out, patching every gap you could find with fresh material, knowing full well that you would be doing the same thing again next year, and the year after that, and every year for as long as you lived in that cabin. It was maintenance that never ended, a battle against entropy that you could never quite win. The floors were another problem entirely. If you were fortunate, you had wooden floorboards laid over a crawl space, which at least kept you off the frozen earth. If you were less fortunate, and many settlers were, especially in their first years on new land, your floor was simply packed dirt, which sounds almost cosy in summer, but becomes a nightmare in winter. Dirt floors wicked cold up from the frozen ground below, turning the entire lower portion of your home into something like a refrigerator. Families with dirt floors often covered them with layers of straw or dried grasses, which helped slightly, but also created opportunities for mice, insects, and other unwelcome guests to take up residence right beneath your feet. The windows deserve special mention because they represent one of the great compromises of 19th century home building. Glass windows were expensive, fragile, and difficult to transport to frontier regions. Many cabins made do with oiled paper stretched over the window frames, paper that had been soaked in linseed oil or animal fat to make it somewhat translucent and slightly more resistant to the elements. This worked better than you might expect for letting in light, but it provided almost no barrier against cold air. Some families simply boarded up their windows entirely during winter months, choosing darkness over drafts, which gives you a sense of just how serious the cold situation could become. Historians still argue whether the log cabin was truly the dominant housing form of the American frontier, or whether this image has been somewhat romanticized by later generations. The reality is that housing varied enormously depending on region, available materials, and the economic status of the family. In the treeless Great Plains, settlers built sod houses, structures made from blocks of prairie turf stacked like bricks. These sod houses actually had some insulating advantages over log cabins, with thick earthen walls that moderated temperature extremes, but they came with their own problems, including dirt constantly falling from the ceiling, water leaking through during rains, and the ever-present company of insects and snakes who found the sod walls to be excellent habitat. In more established areas, you might find clapboard houses, wooden structures with exterior walls made of overlapping horizontal boards. These looked more like what we would recognise as a proper house, but unless they were built with particular care, they were hardly better at keeping out the cold than their log cabin cousins. The boards shrank, gaps opened, and the wind found its way in. Brick construction offered better protection, but was mostly limited to urban areas and the homes of the wealthy. For the average American family in the 1800s, winter meant living in a structure that was perpetually at war with the elements and perpetually losing. Here is something that might shift your perspective on this whole situation. The goal of a 19th century home was never to maintain a comfortable, even temperature throughout the interior the way we expect from modern houses. That would have been impossible with the technology available. Instead, the goal was much more modest. Keep the area immediately around the fire warm enough to survive, and accept that the rest of the house would remain cold. This is why families clustered around the hearth, why beds were positioned as close to the fire as safety allowed, and why venturing to the far corners of your own home could feel like stepping outside. The psychological effect of this living situation is easy to underestimate. You were never truly warm in the way we understand warmth today. You were warm enough, warm in patches, warm on the side of your body facing the fire while your back remained chilled. You learned to rotate yourself like a rotisserie chicken, presenting each side to the heat in turn, never achieving complete comfort but managing enough warmth to function. It sounds almost comical described this way, and there is a certain dark humour to it, but the reality was exhausting. You never fully relaxed, you never let your guard down. The cold was always there, waiting for a moment of inattention. The structure of your home also created stratification of temperature that could be dramatic. Heat rises, as we all learned in school, which meant that the upper portions of a cabin, the sleeping loft if there was one, or simply the airspace near the ceiling, were significantly warmer than the lower portions where you actually lived and worked. Some families with two-storey homes practically abandoned the ground floor during the worst winter months, moving their living activities upstairs where the rising heat from the fire below collected. Children sent to sleep in lofts often had the warmest sleeping conditions in the house, which is not something you would guess from the usual assumptions about kids getting the worst accommodations. But here is the trade-off nobody tells you about those lofts. Heat rises, but so does smoke, and 19th century fireplaces and stoves were not exactly models of combustion efficiency. Sleeping in a loft meant sleeping in the warmest air, but it also meant sleeping in air that was thick with smoke, soot, and the byproducts of whatever you were burning for fuel. Respiratory problems were endemic to this era, and the living conditions of winter months surely contributed. You traded a little extra warmth for a little extra lung damage, and most people made that trade without a second thought, because the alternative was freezing. The home you lived in was not a fortress against winter. It was more like a negotiation with winter, a structure that reduced the cold's assault without ever truly defeating it. Every aspect of your life had to account for this basic reality, and the most important element in that negotiation was not the walls, the floor, or the roof. It was the fire itself, that hungry, demanding, absolutely essential source of heat that stood at the centre of everything. The fireplace dominates your home in ways both physical and psychological. It is not merely a source of warmth, but the gravitational centre around which your entire existence orbits. Everything you do during winter months relates in some way to this opening in your wall, this controlled chaos of flame and ember that demands constant attention and returns the gift of survival in exchange. Without it, you die. With it, you might live. The relationship is that simple and that consuming. The typical fireplace of this era is a large open hearth built into one wall of your cabin, usually constructed of stone or brick if materials allowed, sometimes of packed clay reinforced with sticks if they did not. The opening is wide, perhaps 4 or 5 feet across, and deep enough that you could almost climb inside, which is exactly what people sometimes did when the cold became unbearable. The chimney rising above draws air from the room, creating a draft that pulls smoke upward and out of the house, while simultaneously pulling cold air in through every crack and gap in your walls. This is one of the great ironies of fireplace heating. The very mechanism that removes smoke also increases drafts, so your fire is simultaneously warming you and making your home draftier. The efficiency of these open hearths was appallingly low by modern standards. Historians and engineers who have studied period fireplaces estimate that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the heat generated by the burning wood went straight up the chimney and out into the atmosphere. You were essentially heating the outdoors while capturing only a small fraction of that thermal energy, for your own benefit. This explains why you had to burn such enormous quantities of wood, and why families positioned themselves so close to the flames that their clothing sometimes scorched and their skin reddened from the radiant heat. Distance from the fire meant exponential decrease in warmth. You quickly learned the geometry of survival around your hearth. The zone within 3 or 4 feet of the fire was tolerable, even comfortable. Beyond that, temperatures dropped rapidly, and by the time you reached the far wall of your cabin, perhaps 20 feet away, you might as well have been outside. Families arranged their furniture to cluster within this narrow band of warmth, with the best positions reserved for the most vulnerable members, infants, the elderly, the sick. Everyone else took their turns in the prime spots and accepted their time in the colder margins. The fire demanded feeding with a regularity that shaped your entire daily schedule. A roaring blaze that warmed the room nicely might consume its fuel in an hour or two, leaving you scrambling to add more wood before the temperature plummeted. Families developed rhythms around this need, with different members taking responsibility for fire maintenance at different times of day and night. Someone had to stay awake, or at least sleep lightly enough to rouse when the fire burned low, because letting it die completely meant a miserable morning of restarting from scratch in a room that had dropped to freezing temperatures. Here is a quirky detail that reveals just how central the fire was to daily existence. Legal records from this period occasionally mention disputes over fire maintenance as grounds for domestic strife. If a husband failed to provide adequate firewood, or a wife let the fire die through negligence, these failures could be cited in complaints and even divorce proceedings in some jurisdictions. The ability to maintain the household fire was considered a fundamental duty, a baseline requirement of adult competence, and failure in this regard was taken seriously. Historians still argue whether these legal references indicate genuine social priorities, or simply the creative arguments of lawyers seeking any available grounds for their cases. The skills required to manage an open hearth effectively were not obvious to the uninitiated. You needed to understand which woods burned hot and fast, which smouldered and lasted, how to arrange logs to maximize airflow while preventing collapse, how to bank a fire for overnight survival, how to revive dying embers without smothering them, how to manage the draft, how to prevent chimney fires, and dozens of other technical details that experienced firekeepers had internalized, but newcomers learned only through painful trial and error. Different woods had dramatically different properties, and knowing which to use when was essential knowledge. Hardwoods like oak, hickory and maple burned slowly and produced lasting heat, making them ideal for overnight fires and the main heating needs of the day. Softwoods like pine and fir caught quickly and burned hot, but were consumed rapidly, making them better for starting fires or providing quick bursts of warmth. Seasoned wood, cut and dried for at least a year, burned much more efficiently than green wood, which wasted energy evaporating its internal moisture before it could produce useful heat. A family that had only green wood to burn faced a significantly harder winter than one with properly seasoned stores. The smoke was inescapable. No matter how well your chimney drew, some smoke always found its way into your living space, particularly when you first lit the fire, when you added new logs, or when wind conditions outside created downdrafts that pushed smoke back into the room. Your eyes watered, your throat burned, your clothing and hair absorbed the smell so completely that you stopped noticing it. Though visitors from outdoors could immediately tell you lived with a fire. Chronic eye irritation and respiratory problems were normal parts of life, prices paid for the privilege of not freezing, and the danger. You cannot discuss open hearth living without acknowledging the constant danger. House fires killed people regularly. Clothing caught flame, especially the long skirts worn by women who worked closest to the hearth for cooking. Children fell into fires or pulled burning logs onto themselves. Chimneys caught fire when creosote buildup ignited, sending flames shooting up through the roof. Sparks escaped and landed on flammable materials. The nightmare scenario of waking to find your home ablaze was not a remote possibility, but a genuine risk that everyone lived with daily. Families developed safety practices that became second nature. Fire screens and guards to catch flying sparks, careful supervision of children, regular chimney sweeping to prevent creosote accumulation. The practice of never leaving a fire truly unattended, even if watching it meant sacrificing sleep. Still, accidents happened, and when they did, the consequences could be catastrophic. Fire insurance did not exist in any practical sense for most Americans of this era, and losing your home to fire in winter could easily mean losing your life as well. The hearth also served functions beyond simple heating. It was your stove, your oven, your water heater, your light source after dark, and your social gathering point. Cooking happened in and around the fire, with pots suspended from hooks, skillets nestled in the coals, and bread baked in Dutch ovens buried in the embers. Water was heated for washing, for bathing, for medical purposes. The light of the fire extended your usable hours after sunset, allowing work, reading, or conversation to continue into the evening. Without the fire, darkness fell complete and activities ceased. The psychological warmth of the hearth mattered almost as much as its physical warmth. Gathering around the fire in the evening, watching the flames dance, feeling the heat against your face. These experiences created a sense of security and togetherness that helped families endure the long, dark months. The fire was companionship as much as utility, a living presence in the home that demanded care but returned comfort. Stories were told around the fire, songs were sung, and the youngest members of the family absorbed the traditions and values of their elders in this intimate setting. Historians still argue whether the nostalgia that later generations attach to the hearthside gathering reflects genuine warmth of feeling or simply the romanticization of a harsh necessity. You could not imagine life without your fire, and you did not try to imagine it. The fire was life, and everything else flowed from its existence. The mathematics of firewood are brutal and unforgiving. Every stick you burn in January is a stick you had to cut, split, haul, and stack months earlier, and if your calculations were wrong, if you underestimated your needs, if bad weather prevented you from completing your preparations, if illness struck at the wrong time, you would pay for that error with suffering or worse. The procurement of firewood was not a chore in the modern sense of the word. It was a matter of survival that consumed an enormous portion of your time and energy throughout the year. Let us talk numbers, because the numbers tell a story that words alone cannot convey. A typical family in the American Northeast or Midwest might burn somewhere between 15 and 30 cords of firewood during a single winter, depending on the severity of the weather, the efficiency of their heating arrangement, and how much cold they were willing to endure. A cord, in case you have forgotten your rural measurements, is a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of densely packed timber. 30 cords means nearly 4,000 cubic feet of wood, a pile so large it would take up a significant portion of your property. That wood did not appear by magic. Someone had to identify the trees, fell them with hand tools, cut the trunks into manageable lengths, split those lengths into pieces small enough to fit in a fireplace, and transport everything from the forest to your home. Then it had to be stacked properly to allow air circulation and seasoning, protected from rain and snow, and organised so that the oldest, driest wood could be accessed first while newer cuts continued to cure. This process took months of labour spread across the warmer seasons, labour that competed with farming, hunting, construction, and every other demand on your time. The axe was your primary tool, and swinging it effectively was a skill that took years to develop. A good axeman could fell a medium-sized tree in under an hour and process it into firewood-sized pieces in another hour or two. An inexperienced person might take all day to accomplish the same work, exhausting themselves in the process and possibly injuring themselves with a tool that showed no mercy to the careless. Young boys began learning axe work almost as soon as they were strong enough to lift the tool, because the family's survival depended on having enough competent woodcutters to meet winter's demands. Here is a detail that reveals the true scale of this labour. Historians who have studied the time budgets of 19th century families estimate that firewood procurement and management could consume between 1/4 and 1/3 of all available working hours during the months leading up to winter. This was not a weekend project you knocked out between other responsibilities. It was a central occupation that shaped the entire rhythm of the year, demanding priority over almost every other consideration. The economics of firewood created its own social dynamics. Families with large tracts of forested land were wealthy in a very literal sense. They had heating fuel growing on their property, requiring only labour to convert it to usable form. Families without such land had to acquire wood through other means, purchasing it from neighbours, arranging labour exchanges, or harvesting from common lands if such existed in their area. In some communities, access to woodlots became a contentious issue, with disputes over cutting rights and resource depletion creating conflicts that sometimes lasted generations. The urban poor faced particularly desperate circumstances. City dwellers without land had to purchase all their fuel, and the prices rose dramatically as winter deepened and demand increased. Coal was becoming available in some urban areas by the mid-19th century, offering a more concentrated fuel source that produced more heat per volume, but it too cost money that many families simply did not have. Stories from this era describe families burning furniture, fencing, even structural elements of their own buildings when firewood ran out and funds ran low. The desperation was real, and the consequences were dire. You began your wood procurement in early autumn, before the first hard frosts made outdoor labour more difficult, and you worked steadily through the full months, racing against the calendar to build a stockpile large enough to see your family through until spring. This was a gamble against the unknown. You could not predict exactly how cold the winter would be, how long it would last, or what unexpected demands might arise. The prudent approach was to prepare more than you thought you would need, building a margin of safety that could absorb surprises. Splitting wood was its own art, distinct from felling and cutting. A skilled splitter could read the grain of a log and place their strokes to take advantage of natural weaknesses, cleaving the wood with minimal effort. An unskilled person fought against the grain, exhausting themselves while producing irregular pieces that burned poorly. The maul, a heavy, blunt splitting tool, and the wedge became familiar friends during the autumn months, their weight and balance as familiar as your own hands. Stacking the split wood properly mattered more than you might think. Wood that was thrown into a haphazard pile retained moisture, rotted from the bottom up, and remained difficult to access when snow buried everything under a white blanket. Proper stacking meant creating orderly rows with airflow between the pieces, covered on top to shed rain and snow, but open on the sides to allow drying. Some families built dedicated woodsheds, simple three-sided structures with roofs, to protect their fuel supply. Others made do with tarps, boards, or whatever covering materials were available. The seasoning process continued even after stacking. Green wood, freshly cut, might contain 50% or more of its weight in water. That water had to evaporate before the wood could burn efficiently, which required time, at least 6 months, preferably a full year. This meant that the wood you burned in any given winter had ideally been cut the previous year, creating a rolling cycle of procurement that demanded continuous planning and effort. Families who fell behind in this cycle, burning green wood because they had no choice, faced reduced heating efficiency and increased smoke problems. Historians still argue whether the deforestation that occurred across the American landscape during the 19th century was driven primarily by agricultural clearing, commercial timber operations, or the simple heating needs of a growing population. All three factors played a role, but the sheer volume of wood consumed for domestic heating was certainly significant. Entire forests disappeared to keep families warm, reshaping the ecology of the continent in ways that are still visible today. The work of wood procurement was hard on the body in ways that accumulated over years. Back injuries from lifting and carrying, shoulder and arm strain from swinging axes and mauls, cuts, bruises and splinters beyond counting, hernias from straining under heavy loads. The bodies of 19th century adults bore the evidence of this labour, and many suffered chronic pain and disability as a result. This was simply the price of warmth, paid in flesh and bone over a lifetime. But there was also satisfaction in the work. A deep physical satisfaction in seeing your woodpile grow, knowing that each piece represented a future moment of warmth, a meal cooked, a night survived. The woodpile was a tangible measure of preparation, a visible statement that you had done the work and were ready to face whatever winter brought. The clothing you wear is your first line of defence against the cold, a portable shelter that goes everywhere you go, and in the 1800s, that clothing is both more complicated and more uncomfortable than anything in your modern closet. You layer obsessively, not because layering is fashionable, but because your life depends on trapping every possible pocket of warm air against your skin. Fashion exists, certainly, but survival trumps style when the temperature drops below freezing. Wool is your best friend, your constant companion, the fabric that stands between you and hypothermia. Wool has properties that no other widely available fibre of this era can match. It retains warmth even when wet, it resists odours better than cotton or linen, and its natural crimp creates tiny air pockets that provide insulation. You wear wool undergarments against your skin, wool shirts and bodices over those, wool skirts or trousers over those, and wool coats and cloaks over everything. By the time you are fully dressed for outdoor work, you might be wearing 4 or 5 distinct layers of woolen fabric, each adding its own contribution to your thermal protection. But here is what nobody tells you about all that wool. It itches. Not a gentle, ignorable itch, but an aggressive, maddening irritation that makes you want to tear off your clothes and scratch until your skin bleeds. The wool of this era was not the soft, processed merino you might find in modern outdoor gear. It was rough, coarse, and often still contained traces of lanolin, dirt, and other irritants that scraped against your skin with every movement. People developed calluses in unusual places, toughened their skin through constant exposure, and simply learned to ignore sensations that would drive a modern person to distraction. Linen served as the traditional undergarment fabric, worn closest to the skin beneath the wool layers. Linen was smoother and more comfortable than wool, easier to wash and quicker to dry, but it offered almost no insulation when wet and provided minimal warmth on its own. The function of linen undergarments was primarily to protect the wool from body oils and sweat, extending the time between washings for your outer layers. Washing wool was a major undertaking that risked shrinking and felting the fabric, so the linen sacrificial layer served an important practical purpose. The weight of all these layers was considerable. A fully dressed person heading out for winter work might be carrying 10 or 15 extra pounds of fabric, not counting the weight of boots, hats and gloves. Movement became restricted, and simple tasks required more effort than they would in lighter clothing. You compensated by developing strength and endurance, by pacing yourself, by accepting that winter work simply took longer than summer work. Here is a quirky detail that speaks to the reality of 19th century clothing. Underwear, as we understand it today, was not universal, and many people of this era wore their linen undergarments, essentially long shirts that extended below the waist, without any additional underclothing beneath. The concept of close-fitting drawers or underpants was just beginning to gain acceptance during this period, particularly for women, and many people considered them unnecessary, uncomfortable, or even immodest. This meant that the layering system was somewhat different than a modern person might assume, with more reliance on skirts, petticoats, and loose trouser construction to provide coverage and warmth. Stockings and socks were critical components of the system, and their failure could have serious consequences. Feet were particularly vulnerable to cold because they were in contact with frozen ground, and because the circulation to extremities decreases when the core body is trying to conserve heat. Wool stockings, often hand-knitted by family members during the long winter evenings, provided the first layer of protection. Some people wore multiple pairs simultaneously, building up insulation around their toes and ankles. The problem was that thick stockings made boots fit tightly, potentially restricting circulation and making the cold situation worse rather than better. Boots themselves were leather, which provided reasonable waterproofing when new and well-maintained, but deteriorated quickly under the assault of snow, ice, and constant use. Families applied various treatments to their leather goods: animal fat, beeswax, tallow, attempting to maintain water resistance and flexibility. Despite these efforts, wet feet were a common winter complaint, and the consequences of prolonged exposure to cold moisture included not just discomfort, but genuine medical emergencies like frostbite and trench foot. Headwear was not optional. You lose a significant percentage of your body heat through your head. The exact percentage is debated, with some claims being exaggerated, but the basic principle holds true. Caps, bonnets, hoods, and hats of various designs were worn constantly during cold weather, often indoors as well as out. Many people slept in nightcaps that kept their heads warm as temperatures dropped through the night. The image of the nightcap in historical illustrations is not mere quaintness. It represents a genuine survival adaptation. Gloves and mittens protected hands that needed to remain functional for work. Here, a trade-off existed between warmth and dexterity. Thick mittens provided better insulation because fingers kept together shear warmth, but they made fine manipulation impossible. Thin gloves allowed better dexterity but provided less protection. Many workers compromised by wearing thin gloves under thick mittens, removing the outer layer when detailed work was required and replacing them immediately afterward. Even so, working with cold hands was a constant challenge, and the numbness and clumsiness that accompanied it made accidents more likely. Historians still argue whether the clothing of this era was adequate to the conditions, or whether chronic cold exposure was simply accepted as normal. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. People dressed as warmly as available materials and technologies allowed, and when that was not warm enough, they endured. The concept of being perfectly comfortable outdoors in winter did not exist as a reasonable expectation. You were cold. You were always cold. The goal was to be cold enough to function rather than cold enough to suffer permanent damage. The animal kingdom provided some of the most effective cold weather materials. Fur coats, hats, and linings offered insulation that nothing else could match, and families that could afford fur or lived in areas where it could be trapped or hunted had significant advantages. Beaver, raccoon, fox, bear, and various other pelts appeared in winter wardrobes, providing warmth that wool alone could not achieve. The fur trade that shaped so much of American history was driven in part by this demand for effective cold weather clothing. One final detail worth mentioning: your clothing in this era was infested. Lice, fleas, and other parasites found the warm, rarely washed layers of 19th century clothing to be excellent habitat, and most people lived with these unwelcome companions throughout their lives. The itching you felt was not always just the wool. Sometimes it was tiny creatures making their homes in your garments. This was simply another discomfort of existence, largely accepted and rarely discussed except in extreme cases. The bed becomes your sanctuary when darkness falls, a survival pod designed to preserve your body heat through the long, cold hours of night. Sleep in the 19th century is not the casual retreat to a climate-controlled bedroom that you know today. It is a strategic operation, requiring preparation, equipment, and sometimes cooperation from other bodies. Your bed is the one place where you might actually feel truly warm, and reaching that warmth requires more effort than you might imagine. The bed frame itself is typically made of wood, pine, oak, or whatever local timber was available, with a sleeping surface created by ropes woven back and forth across the frame in a grid pattern. These rope beds, as they were called, had springs in the form of that woven rope, which provided some give and bounce, but also sagged over time as the fibres stretched. The phrase "sleep tight" that we still use today originated as a practical instruction. Tighten the ropes of your bed regularly to prevent sagging into an uncomfortable hammock shape. You used a special tool called a bed key to accomplish this tightening, working your way around the frame to take up slack. On top of those ropes lay your mattress, which in most households was not the plush, supportive cushion of modern times, but a large fabric sack stuffed with whatever filling was available. Straw ticks, mattresses stuffed with straw, were the most common option for ordinary families. They were inexpensive to make, easy to refill when the straw compressed, and tolerable for sleeping if you were not too particular. The straw rustled when you moved, poked through the fabric to jab your skin, and attracted insects that found the warm interior to be excellent habitat. Every few months you would empty the tick, burn or compost the old straw, and refill with fresh material. Feather beds represented the luxury end of the mattress spectrum. A good feather bed, stuffed with down and feathers from geese or ducks, provided warmth and cushioning that straw could never match. Families that could afford feather beds treated them as valuable possessions, passing them down through generations and including them specifically in wills and inheritance documents. The warmth of a feather bed came from the loft of the feathers, which trapped air and created insulation. Climbing into a feather bed on a cold night was one of the genuine pleasures available to those who had access to such luxury. Here is a detail that might surprise you. Many families used feather beds not just beneath them, but on top of them as well. The feather bed became both mattress and blanket, with sleepers essentially sandwiched between two layers of feather-filled comfort. This made sense from a thermodynamic perspective. Surrounding yourself with insulation on all sides maximised heat retention, but it also made getting out of bed in the morning feel like abandoning a warm cocoon for Arctic conditions. The quilts and blankets piled on top of your bed were crucial to night survival, and we will discuss them in more detail shortly. But the bed itself required preparation beyond just the mattress and covers. Climbing into cold sheets on a freezing night was a shock to the system that could actually prevent you from falling asleep, as your body diverted energy to warming the fabric around you rather than relaxing into rest. The solution was bed warmers, metal containers, usually made of brass or copper, with long handles that allowed you to fill them with hot coals or heated water and slide them between the sheets to preheat your sleeping space. Using a bed warmer properly was a skill. Too many coals or coals too hot could scorch the sheets or even start a fire. Too few, or coals that had cooled too much, provided inadequate warming. The timing mattered. Warm the bed just before you were ready to climb in so the heat was still fresh when you needed it. Remove the warmer before getting into bed, or risk burns from contact with the hot metal during the night. Some families used ceramic vessels called bed panning jugs, which were heated in the fire and placed in the bed to radiate warmth. Others filled bottles with hot water, wrapped them in cloth to prevent burns, and tucked them near their feet. And then there was shared sleeping, a practice so universal in this era that it rarely required comment or explanation. The warmth generated by human bodies is significant. Each person produces roughly the same heat output as a 100-watt light bulb, and combining that heat in a shared bed multiplied the warming effect. Families routinely slept multiple people to a bed, with children sharing with siblings or parents, and guests sharing with whoever had space. The boundaries around personal sleeping space that seem so natural to us today simply did not exist in the same way. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford when survival was at stake. This communal sleeping arrangement had interesting social implications. Children grew up sharing beds with siblings of various ages, learning early that sleep was a cooperative rather than solitary activity. Travellers staying at inns often shared beds with strangers, a practice that could lead to uncomfortable situations but was generally accepted as normal. Historians still argue whether shared sleeping was primarily a thermal necessity, or whether it also served social bonding functions that we no longer value in the same way. The truth is probably both. The position of beds within the home was strategic. You placed the bed as close to the fire as safety allowed, knowing that the warmth radiating from the hearth would help offset the cold that crept in through walls and windows. In a single-room cabin, this often meant the bed sat within a few feet of the fireplace, positioned to receive maximum radiant heat while remaining far enough away to avoid sparks. In larger homes with multiple rooms, the question of which room got the bed became important. The warmest room, obviously, which typically meant the room with the fireplace. Sleeping in nightclothes was standard practice, and those nightclothes were designed for warmth rather than fashion. Long nightshirts or nightgowns made of flannel or wool covered the body from neck to ankle, providing a layer of insulation that remained constant regardless of how much you moved or whether the blankets shifted during the night. Nightcaps, as mentioned earlier, kept heads warm, and many people also wore thick stockings to bed, knowing that cold feet made sleep difficult and increased the risk of frostbite in poorly heated homes. The ritual of going to bed on a winter night had a seriousness to it that you might not expect. Building up the fire for its overnight burn, warming the bed, organising the layers of covers, arranging bodies for maximum heat sharing. All of this required attention and effort. Sleep was not something you fell into casually. It was something you prepared for like any other survival task. The blankets and quilts piled on your bed represent hours upon hours of labour, layers of warmth created stitch by stitch, through the work of hands that understood exactly how much protection each layer would provide. In a world where you cannot simply turn up the thermostat when nights grow cold, these textile creations are not decorative choices but survival equipment, and the people who made them treated the work with corresponding seriousness. Quilts hold a special place in American cultural memory, romanticized in museum displays and craft shows, but their original purpose was utterly practical. A quilt is essentially a textile sandwich, 2 layers of fabric with a filling of batting material sewn between them. The stitching holds the layers together and prevents the batting from shifting and bunching, maintaining even insulation across the surface. The top layer might be pieced together from scraps of fabric in decorative patterns. This is the quilting most people picture when they hear the word, but the beauty was almost incidental to the function. Warmth was the point. The batting material inside a quilt determined much of its thermal effectiveness. Cotton batting was common, providing decent insulation at reasonable cost. Wool batting offered superior warmth, but was more expensive and more difficult to work with. Some quilts were stuffed with worn-out blankets or old clothing, recycling textile materials that were too tattered for other purposes, but still retained some insulating value. The thickness of the batting varied according to purpose. Summer quilts might be light, almost decorative, while winter quilts were stuffed thick enough to add noticeable weight to the bed. The labour of quilt making was substantial. A single quilt might represent 60 to 100 hours of work, between piecing the top, assembling the layers, and completing the quilting stitches that held everything together. This labour was too much for one person to accomplish quickly, which gave rise to the quilting bee, a social institution that combined community gathering with productive work. Women would come together at someone's home, set up the quilt on a large frame, and work collectively to complete the stitching, talking and socialising while their hands moved in practiced patterns. Historians still argue whether quilting bees were primarily social events that happened to produce quilts, or production events that happened to be social. The evidence suggests both aspects were important, with the communal nature of the work providing emotional support and connection that helped women endure the isolation of frontier life while also accomplishing practical tasks that no individual could complete as efficiently alone. The quilts that resulted were sometimes given as gifts, sometimes kept for the maker's own family, and sometimes sold or traded for goods and services. Here is a quirky detail about quilts that reveals their importance. They appear frequently in legal documents of this era, mentioned specifically in wills, property inventories, and divorce settlements. A good quilt was a significant asset, representing both the labour that went into creating it and the survival value it provided. Families tracked which quilts belonged to whom, and disputes over quilt ownership could be taken quite seriously. This was not mere sentimentality, though sentiment certainly attached to quilts made by beloved family members, but practical recognition of real value. Beyond quilts, families relied on wool blankets for bedding warmth. Heavy woolen blankets, some weighing several pounds apiece, were layered on top of quilts to build up insulation. The weight of all these coverings was itself remarkable. A fully made winter bed might have 30 or 40 pounds of blankets and quilts piled on top of it, enough weight that sleepers felt pressed into their mattresses. This weight was not just a side effect, but actually contributed to warmth, as compression of the body reduced the surface area exposed to cold air. Coverlets were another textile option, woven rather than quilted, often in decorative patterns that showcased the weaver's skill. A good coverlet took even longer to produce than a quilt, requiring a loom and expertise in complex weaving techniques. Coverlets were sometimes purchased from professional weavers or bartered for from neighbours with the necessary equipment and skills. Like quilts, they appear in estate inventories and legal documents as items of significant value. The bedding collection of a 19th century family was the accumulated work of years, sometimes generations. Quilts made by grandmothers were still in use decades after their creation. The fabrics worn soft, but the stitching still holding strong. New quilts were added as families grew, with young women sometimes beginning their quilting careers by making bedding for their eventual married homes, creating warmth they would need before they knew exactly where or with whom they would use it. Maintaining this bedding required effort as well. Quilts and blankets needed airing to prevent musty odours and the accumulation of moisture from sleeping bodies. They needed protection from moths and other pests that could destroy wool fibres. They needed occasional washing, though this was less frequent than modern sensibilities might expect, as the process of washing, drying, and reconditioning heavy textiles was labour-intensive and risked damaging the materials. Careful families beat their bedding outdoors, hung it in the sun to freshen, and stored it with herbs or other moth deterrents during warmer months. The bedding ritual each night involved arranging all these layers in proper order for maximum warmth. The sheet went down first, if you had sheets, which not everyone did, followed by lighter blankets, then quilts, then heavier blankets on top. Some people preferred the heaviest layer closest to their bodies, others preferred it on the outside. The arrangement was partly personal preference and partly physics, as different configurations trapped and retained heat differently. Children learned these arrangements from watching their parents, absorbing practical knowledge that would serve them throughout their lives. Getting into a properly layered bed and pulling all those covers up around you was a small triumph on winter nights. You had done the work, the wood gathering, the fire building, the bed warming, the cover arranging, and now you could claim your reward, a pocket of warmth that would sustain you through the dark hours. The weight of the blankets pressed down reassuringly, the feather bed cushioned your tired body, and the accumulated heat of all those layers began to build around you. Remember this feeling as we continue, this sensation of earned warmth after labour and preparation. The 19th century offered few guarantees, but a well-made bed came close to being one of them. The kitchen is not a separate room in your cabin, but simply the area closest to the fire, the zone where cooking and heating overlap in a continuous dance of flame and necessity. Everything you eat during winter months passes through, or near that fire, and the skills required to feed a family using only the heat of burning wood are more complex than anything you will find in a modern cookbook. Your survival depends not just on having food, but on knowing how to prepare it under conditions that would frustrate any contemporary chef. The cooking hearth is both your stove and your oven, and using it effectively requires a deep understanding of fire behaviour. You cannot simply set a temperature and wait. Instead, you manage zones of heat within the fireplace, with some areas burning intensely while others smoulder gently, some spots suitable for rapid boiling, while others maintain the low warmth needed for slow simmering. The experienced cook reads the fire constantly, adjusting the position of pots and pans, adding or removing fuel, managing the airflow to achieve the results each dish requires. Pots hang from iron cranes that swing in and out of the fireplace, allowing you to position them directly over the flames or pull them to the side for gentler heat. These cranes pivot on hinges built into the fireplace masonry, and the chains that suspend the pots can be raised or lowered to adjust the distance from the fire. Additional hooks called trammels provide even finer control, with notched bars that allow precise height adjustment. Mastering this equipment is essential knowledge that daughters learn from mothers through years of observation and practice. The Dutch oven is one of your most versatile tools, a heavy cast iron pot with a flanged lid designed to hold hot coals on top. You use it for baking bread, roasting meat, cooking stews, and virtually anything else that benefits from even surrounding heat. The technique involves burying the Dutch oven in the coals of the hearth, heaping additional coals on the lid, and then waiting while the food inside cooks in its own enclosed environment. The results can be remarkably good, but the timing and coal management require experience. Too many coals, or coals that burn too hot, and your bread burns on the outside while remaining raw within. Too few coals and you wait hours for food that never quite finishes. Here is something that might seem strange from a modern perspective. In many 19th century households, the fire never went completely out during the entire winter season. Keeping a fire continuously burning was actually easier than restarting from scratch each day, and it ensured that cooking could begin immediately whenever needed. The banking of fires overnight, covering the active coals with ash to slow their combustion without extinguishing them entirely, was a skill passed down through generations, and the first task each morning was reviving these banked coals back to useful flames. The food you cook during winter is dominated by preserved ingredients that you prepared during the warmer months. Fresh vegetables are largely unavailable. Fresh meat must be consumed quickly before it spoils even in cold weather, and the variety of your diet narrows dramatically compared to summer abundance. You rely heavily on root vegetables that store well in cold conditions, preserved meats that can last for months, dried beans and grains that provide sustenance if not excitement, and whatever dairy products your animals can still produce during the lean months. Soups and stews become dietary staples because they stretch limited ingredients, provide warming comfort, and can simmer for hours with minimal attention. A pot of stew hung near the fire in the morning can bubble gently all day, growing more flavourful as time passes, ready whenever family members need nourishment. The liquid base helps extend small amounts of meat to feed many mouths, and the long cooking breaks down tough cuts into tender morsels. Your grandmother's stew recipe is not a sentimental tradition. It is a survival strategy refined over generations. Bread remains essential even when other foods grow scarce, and baking it properly in a hearth takes considerable skill. Some households have separate bake ovens built into the fireplace structure, brick-lined chambers that you heat by burning a fire inside them, then rake out the coals and slide in the bread to bake in the retained heat. Others rely on Dutch ovens or covered iron pots. Either way, bread baking is a weekly ritual that consumes hours and produces loaves that must last until the next baking day. Fresh bread is a treat. Bread several days old is simply what you eat. Historians still argue whether the diet of 19th century Americans during winter months provided adequate nutrition, or whether seasonal deficiencies contributed to the health problems that often emerged in early spring. Vitamin deficiencies, particularly scurvy from lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, were documented concerns, and folk wisdom about the health-giving properties of certain preserved foods may have reflected genuine nutritional insight. Sauerkraut, for example, retains vitamin C through the fermentation process, and communities that ate it regularly may have fared better than those who relied entirely on salted and dried provisions. The connection between fire and food means that the rhythms of cooking and the rhythms of heating overlap constantly. You cannot let the fire burn low just because no meal is being prepared, because the house would begin cooling immediately. You cannot build the fire too high for efficient cooking, because you might overheat the living space or consume fuel too rapidly. Every decision about the fire is simultaneously a decision about warmth and a decision about food, and balancing these needs requires constant attention. The warmth of cooking is itself a form of comfort on winter days, not just the warmth of the fire, but the warmth of food entering your body, raising your core temperature, providing the calories your body burns to maintain itself against the cold. A hot meal on a frozen evening is medicine as much as it is sustenance, and the person who prepares that meal is providing care that goes beyond mere nutrition. Food preservation is not a hobby or a lifestyle choice. It is the difference between eating through winter and starving before spring arrives. The months of warmth are a race against time, a frantic effort to capture summer's abundance and transform it into forms that will sustain you through months, when nothing grows and fresh food becomes a distant memory. Every technique you employ represents accumulated wisdom about delaying decay, and every jar, barrel, and cured ham hanging in your rafters is insurance against hunger. Salt is your primary weapon against spoilage, a mineral so valuable that it has shaped economies and political boundaries throughout human history. Salt draws moisture from meat, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that cause decay. You pack pork in barrels with layers of salt, rub salt into beef and hang it to cure, soak fish in brine until it can last for months without refrigeration. The saltiness of preserved meat is sometimes overwhelming to the modern palate, but you learn to soak it in fresh water before cooking, drawing out enough salt to make it tolerable, while retaining enough to maintain preservation. Smoking adds another layer of protection, while also imparting flavours that have become signatures of American cuisine. The smokehouse, if you have one, is a small outbuilding where meat hangs in the path of slow, cool smoke for days or even weeks. The smoke deposits antimicrobial compounds on the surface of the meat, while the low heat dries it further, creating conditions that resist spoilage. Ham, bacon, and various sausages emerge from this process, transformed into products that can last through winter and beyond. Here is a detail that illuminates how central preservation was to daily existence. The timing of hog slaughter was determined not by when you wanted fresh pork, but by when temperatures dropped low enough to make preservation reliable. In most regions, this meant late November or early December, after the first hard frosts but before the deepest cold made outdoor work unbearable. The days following slaughter were a flurry of activity: butchering, salting, smoking, rendering fat, making sausage, all hands contributing to process the animal before anything could spoil. Root cellars provided the refrigeration of this era. underground spaces where cool temperatures remained relatively constant year-round. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets, parsnips, onions, and cabbages could be stored in root cellars for months, their natural preservation mechanisms extending their usefulness deep into winter. The technique required knowledge. Different vegetables wanted different conditions of temperature and humidity. Some stored well touching others, while some released gases that accelerated spoilage of their neighbours. A poorly managed root cellar could lose half its contents to rot. A well-managed one could provide vegetables nearly until spring. Pickling extended the life of vegetables that would not survive simple root storage. Cucumbers became pickles, cabbage became sauerkraut, various vegetables became relishes and preserves. The acidic environment created by fermentation or vinegar prevented the growth of dangerous bacteria, while transforming flavours in ways that many people genuinely enjoyed. A crock of sauerkraut bubbling in the corner of the kitchen was not just food preservation, it was a living process that required attention and yielded results you could take pride in. Drying removed the moisture that bacteria need to survive, transforming perishable foods into shelf-stable ones. Apples sliced thin and dried became a winter snack. Berries dried became flavourful additions to baked goods. Beans dried became protein that could last for years under proper conditions. Some drying happened in the sun during late summer, while other drying used the residual heat of the fire during cooler months. Strings of dried apple rings hanging near the hearth were a common sight, the gentle warmth slowly removing moisture without cooking the fruit. The root crops that form the backbone of winter vegetable consumption deserve special mention. Potatoes, introduced to America from South America and rapidly embraced as a dietary staple, could be stored in enormous quantities and provided calories and modest nutrition through the lean months. Turnips, less loved by modern palates, were winter workhorses that filled bellies when nothing else was available. Parsnips sweetened after frost exposure, becoming more palatable as winter deepened. These humble vegetables were not exciting, but they were reliable, and reliability counted for everything when survival was at stake. Historians still argue whether 19th century Americans suffered seasonal malnutrition, or whether their preservation and storage techniques maintained adequate nutrition throughout winter. The evidence suggests that deficiencies were real, but varied significantly by region, economic status, and family practice. Wealthier families with diverse stored provisions likely fared better than poor families dependent on a narrow range of preserved foods. Geographic variations in what could be grown and stored also mattered, with some regions having access to foods that were unavailable elsewhere. The emotional weight of a full larder in November cannot be overstated. Looking at shelves lined with preserved foods, barrels of salted meat, bins of root vegetables, strings of dried herbs and fruits, this visual evidence of preparation provided psychological comfort that went beyond mere calories. You knew that barring disaster, you could feed your family. You knew that the work of summer had translated into security for winter. This knowledge settled something deep in the mind, allowing you to face the cold months with something approaching confidence. But the calculation was never entirely certain. Stored food could spoil unexpectedly. Mice and other pests could raid your supplies. Family illness could prevent you from completing preparations. A larger family gathering than expected could deplete stores faster than planned. The anxiety never entirely disappeared, it merely receded to a manageable level when preparations went well. Water becomes your daily adversary in winter, transforming from a simple necessity into a frozen obstacle that requires labour and ingenuity to overcome. The pump is frozen, the well is iced over, the nearby stream is locked under inches of hard surface, and yet your family needs water for drinking, cooking, washing, and caring for animals. Every drop you use during the cold months comes at a cost of effort, and you learn to conserve in ways that would seem extreme to anyone accustomed to turning a tap. The well, if you are fortunate enough to have one, is your primary water source, but winter transforms it into a challenging extraction point. The pump mechanism freezes if not properly protected, the bucket rope stiffens and becomes difficult to handle, and the water itself may freeze in the bucket before you can get it indoors. Families develop rituals around well maintenance, wrapping the pump in straw or old blankets, pouring hot water down the mechanism to thaw frozen parts, maintaining a layer of wooden planks over the well opening to trap slightly warmer air below. For those without wells, water comes from streams, ponds or springs. each of which freezes with varying thickness depending on conditions. You learn to read ice, judging where it is thick enough to support your weight and where dangerous thin spots might send you plunging into frigid water. You carry tools for breaking through ice, axes, iron bars, heavy wooden mallets, and you return to the same hole day after day, keeping it open against the continuous efforts of the cold to seal it over. The hole freezes overnight, of course, requiring fresh breaking each morning. Here is a practical detail that reveals the labour involved. A family of 6 might need 10 to 15 gallons of water, daily for basic needs, and every gallon had to be carried by hand from source to home. In summer, this was simply tedious. In winter, with ice to break, snow to navigate, and frozen ground threatening to turn an ankle with every step, the water-carrying journey became genuinely difficult. Children were often assigned this task as soon as they were strong enough to carry partial loads, learning early that water did not appear magically, but was earned through effort. Snow offered an alternative water source, abundant and readily available during winter months, but melting snow for water was surprisingly inefficient. Snow contains a great deal of air, so a full bucket of snow yields only a small amount of water when melted. The melting process requires heat, which means burning precious firewood to produce water you could have obtained more efficiently from a well or stream. Most families used snow water only when no liquid source was accessible, treating it as a backup rather than a primary supply. Once obtained, water had to be protected from freezing indoors, which was not guaranteed in poorly heated homes. Families positioned water containers near the fire, brought them into bed overnight, or simply accepted that a thin layer of ice would form on stored water and would need to be broken before use. The phrase "breaking the ice" that we use metaphorically today had a very literal application in 19th century mornings. The scarcity and difficulty of water influenced every aspect of winter hygiene and household practice. Bathing became infrequent, not from indifference to cleanliness, but from the practical impossibility of heating enough water to fill a tub, while also maintaining house temperature and preserving fuel supplies. Many families limited full baths to once a week or less, supplementing with spot washing of hands and face as needed. The Saturday night bath became a tradition in part because it was manageable to heat water once a week, and Sunday's church attendance provided motivation to be presentable. Laundry was another water-intensive activity that winter made difficult. Washing clothes required large quantities of water, both for washing and rinsing, plus the heat to make that water warm enough to clean effectively. Winter laundry therefore became a major production, scheduled for days when other circumstances allowed focusing energy on this single task. Clothes were worn longer between washings, stains were tolerated that would be unacceptable in other seasons, and garments that fell into genuine filth might simply be set aside until conditions improved. Historians still argue whether the reduced bathing and laundry practices of winter months contributed significantly to disease transmission, or whether the cold temperatures themselves reduced pathogen activity enough to offset the decreased hygiene. The evidence is mixed, with some diseases showing reduced winter transmission while others, particularly respiratory illnesses, actually increased. The cold itself may have been a more important health factor than cleanliness during these months. The animals also needed water adding to the daily labour. Livestock could not break their own ice or haul their own buckets, so their care fell to you. Chickens, pigs, horses, cattle, each required water daily, and providing it meant multiple trips to the well or stream, multiple battles with frozen surfaces, multiple opportunities for accidents on slippery ground. Animal welfare in winter was directly tied to human labour, and exhausted humans sometimes cut corners that left animals suffering. Water management in winter was a constant daily concern that never entirely receded from your attention. You thought about it in the evening when you wondered if you had enough stored for morning. You thought about it at dawn when you dressed for the first trip to the well. You thought about it throughout the day as you rationed usage and planned how much you would need for each task. This constant awareness seems burdensome from a modern perspective, but it was simply the texture of life, the price of existing before plumbing made water invisible. Your animals are not merely property, they are survival partners whose well-being is inseparable from your own. The cow that provides milk, the pig that provides meat, the chickens that provide eggs, the horse that provides transportation and labour. These creatures require care through winter months, and their survival depends on your preparation and attention, just as your survival depends on their continued productivity. The relationship is mutual, interdependent, and fundamental to making it through until spring. The barn, if you have one, becomes almost as important as the house during winter months. It shelters your animals from the worst of the weather, keeps them contained where you can care for them, and provides a space where their collective body heat actually makes a difference. A barn with several cows, a horse, and various smaller animals inside can be noticeably warmer than the outside air, thanks to the metabolic heat those bodies produce. Some families understood this well enough to spend time in the barn themselves when conditions in the house became unbearable. Here is a quirky detail that speaks to the intimacy between humans and animals in this era. Some families brought small animals inside the house during extreme cold snaps. Chickens might be temporarily housed in a corner of the kitchen, their body heat contributing a tiny amount to the home's warmth, while their lives were preserved against killing frost. Newborn lambs or calves, too fragile to survive barn temperatures, were sometimes kept near the hearth until they gained enough strength to tolerate outdoor conditions. The boundaries between human space and animal space were more permeable than modern sensibilities might suggest. Feeding animals through winter required the same kind of advanced preparation that feeding humans required. Hay had to be cut, dried, and stored during summer months in quantities sufficient to sustain livestock through months when pastures lay frozen and dormant. A single cow might consume 2 to 3 tons of hay during a typical winter, and a horse even more. Calculating these needs and meeting them was a fundamental summer task, and failure meant either watching animals starve or slaughtering them early, losing future productivity for immediate meat. Grain supplemented hay for animals that needed additional calories, particularly working horses and milk cows. Corn, oats, and other feed grains stored well in dry conditions and provided concentrated nutrition that hay alone could not match. The balance between hay and grain was both an economic and nutritional calculation, with grain being more expensive but sometimes necessary to maintain animal health and productivity through the demanding months. Water for animals presented the same challenges as water for humans, multiplied by the quantities involved. A single horse might drink 10 to 15 gallons daily, a cow slightly less, and the herd collectively needed enormous quantities that had to be transported or made available through broken ice at streams or ponds. Some farmers positioned their barns near water sources specifically to reduce the labour of winter watering. Others resigned themselves to hauling buckets twice daily for every animal in their care. The economics of livestock in winter were unforgiving. Animals that did not produce, dry cows, non-laying hens, horses too old for work, still consumed feed and required care. Many families slaughtered such animals in late fall, converting non-productive mouths into preserved meat while reducing winter feed requirements. The decision of which animals to keep and which to cull was practical rather than sentimental, though families often developed genuine affection for particular animals that made the calculations emotionally difficult. Milk production declined dramatically during winter months, even from cows that were not dry. The reduced daylight, the cold temperatures, and the less nutritious feed all contributed to lower yields, meaning that families who relied on fresh milk and dairy products through summer had to adjust their expectations for winter. Some cows stopped producing entirely until spring, others continued at reduced levels that made every cup of milk precious. Historians still argue whether 19th century animal husbandry practices constituted adequate care by modern standards, or whether the limitations of available knowledge and resources meant that animals suffered unnecessarily. The evidence suggests that farmers generally did their best with what they knew and had, but that the best available practices still resulted in significant animal mortality during harsh winters. Disease spread through confined populations, inadequate nutrition weakened immune systems, and extreme cold overwhelmed the animal's ability to maintain body temperature despite farmers' efforts. The emotional bond between farmers and their animals was real, even when economic necessity required hard decisions. A family cow was often the closest thing to a pet that rural children experienced, with a name, a recognised personality, and a place in daily life that went beyond mere utility. Losing that cow to winter's demands, whether through death or necessary slaughter, carried genuine grief, especially for children who had helped care for the animal through gentler seasons. Your morning chores during winter began in the cold darkness before dawn, when animals needed their first feeding and watering of the day. You dressed in your warmest clothing, gathered the tools and buckets you would need, and stepped out into conditions that might feature temperatures well below zero, winds that cut through any protection, and footing so treacherous that each step required care. The animals waited depending on you entirely, and their needs did not bend to weather that made humans wish to stay in bed. The reward for this labour was tangible: eggs gathered warm from beneath the hens, milk still steaming as it filled the pail, the knowledge that your animals would survive another day and continue to provide for your family. This daily exchange, your labour for their productivity, formed the foundation of subsistence agriculture, and breaking that exchange even once could cascade into consequences that threatened everything you had worked to build. The outhouse stands at the edge of your property, a small wooden structure that represents one of the most dreaded aspects of winter existence. Everything about this necessary building seems designed to make cold weather bathroom trips as unpleasant as possible, and yet nature's call does not pause for temperature. You will make that journey across frozen ground, sit on that ice-cold wooden seat, and expose parts of your body that desperately want to remain covered because you have no choice. The distance from your cabin to the outhouse is not accidental. Sanitary logic demanded separation between living quarters and waste facilities, reducing odours and limiting the spread of disease. In summer, this arrangement made perfect sense. In winter, the 50 or 75 feet between house and outhouse becomes an expedition through snow, wind, and cold that can feel like miles. Every trip is a calculation. How urgently do you need to go? How bad are the conditions outside, and can you possibly wait until circumstances improve? The answer is often that you cannot wait. The privy calls when the privy calls, and you answer at 2 a.m. despite temperatures that could cause frostbite in minutes. You throw on whatever clothing lies nearest, coat over nightshirt, boots pulled on over bare feet, no time or patience for proper layering, and you hurry through conditions that wake you completely from any sleepiness, completing your business as quickly as possible before retreating to the relative warmth of your home. Here is a quirky detail that you will not find in most history books. Experienced families learn to pre-warm the outhouse seat before sitting. This might involve placing a heated stone or brick on the seat in advance, or in some cases pouring warm water over the wood to melt any frost accumulation. The alternative, bare skin meeting a seat that might be frozen to temperatures well below zero, was an experience so shocking that people developed any strategy they could to avoid it. The chamber pot was the indoor alternative that most families relied on during night hours and the worst weather. A ceramic or metal pot, often decorative enough to sit openly in the bedroom without embarrassment, the chamber pot allowed you to relieve yourself without leaving the house. The obvious drawback was that the pot required emptying, and that tasks could not be delayed indefinitely. The smell of an unemptied chamber pot was not pleasant, and the accumulation of waste was unsanitary. Someone, usually a woman or older child, had to carry the pot to the outhouse and empty it, a task that was no more pleasant than using the outhouse directly, but at least allowed the original user to avoid the midnight walk. Historians still argue about the hygiene practices surrounding chamber pots and human waste in this era, with some suggesting that standards were higher than often assumed, and others emphasising the limitations of available sanitation. What seems clear is that practices varied enormously by family, region, and economic status, and that the winter months made everyone's sanitation situation worse regardless of their usual standards, and the actual use of toilet paper was not standard in this period. That innovation would not become widely available until the late 19th century. Instead, families used whatever materials were available. Pages from old catalogues or newspapers, corn cobs in rural areas, leaves in warmer seasons, and various other solutions that range from the merely uncomfortable to the genuinely unpleasant. The Sears Roebuck catalogue, when it arrived in the later decades, became infamous for this secondary use, and the transition to smaller glossy pages was reportedly lamented by many rural Americans who had found the old pages served dual purposes effectively. The frozen waste in an outhouse pit presented its own unique situation. In deep winter, deposits froze relatively quickly, reducing odour but creating accumulation that could become problematic when spring thaws finally arrived. Some families took advantage of the frozen conditions to clean out pits that would have been impossible to manage in warmer weather, though this task was never popular regardless of the season. The psychological burden of winter bathroom trips extended beyond simple discomfort. For women wearing multiple layers of skirts and undergarments, the process of accessing and then recovering their clothing in freezing conditions took longer, and required more exposure than men typically experienced. For the elderly or infirm, the walk through snow and the physical requirements of the outhouse presented genuine challenges that sometimes limited their ability to function independently. Children were often afraid of the dark outhouse, the cold, and the stories that older siblings told about what lurked in the privy pit. Privacy in these matters was limited in ways that modern people might find shocking. Multiple-seat outhouses, 2-holers, 3-holers, were common, designed to allow several family members to use the facility simultaneously. This made sense from a construction efficiency standpoint, and in a world where families routinely slept together and bathed together, shared bathroom facilities did not carry the taboo they would later acquire. Still, the experience of sitting beside a sibling on adjoining privy seats, while both attended to bodily functions, was a form of intimacy that has largely disappeared from modern life. The return trip to the house after an outhouse visit had its own character. You hurried back through the cold, entered the relative warmth of your home, and felt the contrast between outside and inside more sharply than at any other time. The heat of the fire was never more welcome than in those moments, and you appreciated warmth that you might otherwise take for granted. Every uncomfortable trip to the privy was a reminder of just how much the cold dominated your existence. The children of your household face winter's challenges with vulnerabilities that adults do not share, their small bodies struggling to maintain warmth in conditions that push even fully grown people to their limits. Your constant worry during the cold months centers on these young ones, the infant who cannot generate enough heat alone, the toddler who does not understand the dangers of cold exposure, the older children who must venture out for chores despite temperatures that would keep adults indoors if choice existed. Keeping them alive and healthy through winter requires vigilance that never truly rests. Infants were particularly at risk, and infant mortality rates during winter months were substantially higher than during other seasons. A baby cannot move to warm itself, cannot communicate specifically what it needs, cannot even shiver effectively in the early weeks of life. The responsibility fell entirely on caregivers to monitor the infant's temperature constantly, to keep it wrapped and warm, to position it near the fire without creating burn hazards, and to watch for signs of distress that might indicate dangerous chilling. The cradle was positioned as close to the hearth as safety permitted, often within arm's reach of the mother so she could rock it while attending to other tasks. Night presented the greatest danger when fires burned low and attention flagged. Many families brought infants into bed with parents, using body heat to supplement blankets and the fading warmth of the banked fire. This practice carried its own risks, the danger of accidentally smothering a baby, the concern about transmitting illness through close contact. But these risks seemed manageable compared to the certainty of cold exposure. Here is a heartbreaking detail that speaks to the realities of this era. Families often lost infants during winter months, and the grief of these losses was compounded by the inability to properly bury small bodies until spring thaw softened the frozen ground. In some communities, families kept deceased infants in unheated outbuildings through winter, waiting for conditions that would allow proper burial. This practice seems macabre to modern sensibilities, but was simply practical necessity under impossible circumstances. Swaddling was more than traditional practice, it was thermal management. Wrapping an infant tightly in layers of fabric concentrated body heat reduced heat loss from exposed skin and prevented the baby from kicking off its covers. The swaddling clothes were layered carefully, with soft linen against the skin and warmer wool on the outside, building a cocoon that the infant could not escape. Some historians argue that swaddling was too restrictive, limiting movement and possibly contributing to developmental issues, while others contend that the thermal benefits in cold environments outweighed any negative effects. Older children faced different challenges. As soon as they were old enough to contribute to household labour, they were expected to help with chores that took them outdoors regardless of weather. Gathering firewood, carrying water, tending animals, running errands. These tasks could not be skipped simply because a child was cold, and frostbite, hypothermia, and cold-related illness were real risks. Parents balanced the need for their children's labour against the danger that labour posed, making calculations that often erred on the side of necessity over safety. Clothing for children was a particular challenge. Children grew rapidly, and winter garments that fit one year might be hopelessly small the next. The labour of making clothing, spinning thread, weaving fabric, cutting and sewing garments was substantial, and it had to be repeated constantly as children outgrew their wardrobes. Many families relied on hand-me-downs, passing clothes from older to younger siblings, patching and altering as needed to extend useful life. A child might wear garments several generations removed from their original owner, with patches upon patches showing the history of their use. Historians still argue whether childhood in this era was as harsh as conditions suggest, or whether the adaptations children made allowed them to experience genuine joy and play, despite environmental challenges. The evidence supports both perspectives. Children did suffer, sometimes terribly, from cold and its consequences, but they also played in snow, built sledding runs, explored frozen landscapes, and found entertainment in conditions that would keep modern children indoors. Resilience and misery coexisted in ways that are difficult to disentangle from this distance. The schoolhouse, for families who had access to one, presented its own heating challenges. A single stove or fireplace in a building filled with children created temperature zones that ranged from too hot near the heat source to too cold in distant corners. Teachers made seating assignments that rotated students through different temperature zones, attempting to distribute both privilege and discomfort equally. Children sat with shawls and coats on, their breath visible in the air of poorly heated rooms, struggling to concentrate on lessons while their fingers grew numb from cold. Education often decreased during winter months, either because travelling to school was impossible or because children were needed for household labour that increased during cold seasons. The school calendar of later eras, with its long summer break, reflects agricultural realities more than temperature concerns, but in many communities the coldest months also saw reduced school attendance as children remained closer to home fires. The emotional lives of children during winter were shaped by confinement and the stresses that affected their parents. Family tensions increased when people could not escape each other, when work was relentless, when comfort was scarce. Children absorbed these tensions and responded in ways that might include behavioural problems, illness without organic cause, or withdrawal into their own interior worlds. A mother's patience, stretched thin by the demands of winter survival, might snap in ways that left lasting impressions on young minds. Yet there were also moments of warmth that had nothing to do with fire. The warmth of family gathered together, of stories told during long evenings, of small treats and celebrations that broke the monotony. Winter holidays, when they existed for a family's tradition, provided focal points of joy amid the hardship. The very difficulty of the season could make its small pleasures sweeter. Illness stalks your household with particular menace during winter months, when the conditions that make you cold also make you vulnerable to diseases that your body might have fought off more easily in gentler seasons. The cold itself can kill directly through hypothermia and frostbite, but it also enables a host of other afflictions that claim lives throughout the winter months. Your medicine cabinet, if you can call it that, contains remedies that range from useless to actively harmful, and the medical profession of this era offers little that would pass muster by modern standards. Respiratory infections were the great winter killers. Pneumonia, influenza, consumption. These diseases found easy targets in populations weakened by cold exposure, poor nutrition, and the smoke-filled air of poorly ventilated homes. A cough that began as a minor irritation could progress to fluid-filled lungs and death within weeks, and there was essentially nothing effective that anyone could do once serious infection took hold. Families watched helplessly as loved ones struggled for breath, their lips turning blue from lack of oxygen, their bodies burning with fever even as the room around them remained cold. Here is something that illuminates the helplessness of this medical era. The treatments prescribed for respiratory illness often made patients worse rather than better. Bleeding was still practiced by many physicians, weakening already struggling patients by removing the blood they desperately needed to fight infection. Purgatives and emetics were administered, causing vomiting and diarrhea that dehydrated sick people. Mercury-based compounds were given for various complaints, slowly poisoning those they were meant to heal. The phrase, "the cure is worse than the disease," was literal rather than metaphorical. Frostbite was a more visible threat, the blackened fingers and toes that resulted from cold exposure severe enough to freeze tissue. The treatment recommended by most sources of this era was gradual rewarming, advice that remains sound today. But the execution often went wrong. Rubbing frostbitten skin, which seemed logical as a way to restore circulation, actually damaged fragile frozen tissue. Exposing frostbitten extremities to sudden intense heat, like thrusting frozen hands into hot water, could cause additional injury, and the gangrene that sometimes followed severe frostbite often led to amputation performed without anesthesia, Using techniques that frequently caused fatal infections, hypothermia itself was poorly understood. The progression from shivering to confusion to unconsciousness to death was observed but not scientifically explained, and the recommendations for treatment varied widely. Some sources advised vigorous activity to warm a cold person, potentially good advice for mild cold exposure, but dangerous for someone whose core temperature had dropped significantly. Others recommended alcohol consumption, which actually worsens hypothermia by dilating blood vessels and increasing heat loss. The victims of hypothermia who survived did so despite rather than because of the medical understanding of their era. Folk remedies filled the gap left by professional medicine's limitations. Mustard plasters applied to the chest were believed to treat lung congestion. The burning sensation they produced on the skin was taken as evidence of therapeutic action. Onion poultices, garlic preparations, and various herbal teas were administered according to traditions passed down through generations. Some of these remedies may have provided genuine comfort or even modest benefit. Others did nothing. A few probably caused harm. Historians still argue whether the folk medical traditions of this era represented accumulated practical wisdom or simply superstition without foundation. The reality is almost certainly mixed. Some traditional treatments aligned with principles that modern science would validate, while others were based on misunderstandings about how the body worked. Families did the best they could with the knowledge available to them, and their best was often heartbreakingly inadequate. The death rate during winter months was significantly higher than during other seasons, and this elevated mortality affected every community and every social class. The wealthy had advantages: better housing, more fuel, more food, access to whatever medical care existed. But even wealth could not fully protect against the diseases that flourished when cold drove people indoors into close contact with each other. Tuberculosis in particular respected no social boundaries, claiming victims across the economic spectrum. Caring for the sick during winter added another layer of difficulty to already demanding circumstances. Someone had to stay awake through the night to monitor a feverish patient and maintain the fire that kept the sick room warm. Food had to be prepared for those who could eat, and liquids pressed on those who could not. The work of nursing was almost always women's work, performed on top of all the other labour that winter required, creating exhaustion that compromised the caregiver's own health. The psychological burden of winter illness extended beyond the immediate fear of death. Watching family members suffer without being able to provide effective relief was its own form of torture. Wondering whether the cough that your child developed would progress to something fatal, or whether this would be one of the lucky infections that the body fought off successfully, created anxiety that coloured every winter day. The relief when someone recovered was matched only by the grief when someone did not. Quarantine practices, when they existed, were primitive by modern standards. Families sometimes attempted to isolate sick members in separate rooms, but the realities of heating and space often made true isolation impossible. The infection spread through households, claiming multiple victims in waves that left some families decimated. Communities that successfully contained outbreaks did so through luck as much as strategy, and communities that failed paid terrible prices. And yet people endured. They nursed their sick, buried their dead, and continued living through winters that brought sickness as surely as they brought snow. The resilience required was extraordinary, and the emotional calluses that developed from repeated loss were perhaps necessary for psychological survival, even as they seem troubling from a modern therapeutic perspective. A revolution is coming to American homes, though you might not recognize it as revolutionary when you first encounter it. The cast iron stove, that blocky, heavy, seemingly inelegant piece of equipment, will transform the way people survive winter more dramatically than any innovation since the controlled use of fire itself. When you first see one sitting in a corner of a wealthier neighbour's home or on display in a general store, you might wonder what all the fuss is about, but those who have lived with one will tell you, this changes everything. The open fireplace that has dominated your existence is, as we have discussed, appallingly inefficient. The vast majority of the heat it produces goes straight up the chimney, warming the outside air rather than your home. The cast iron stove addresses this fundamental problem by containing the fire within an enclosed metal box that radiates heat in all directions. Instead of sending 90% of your thermal energy up the flue, a well-designed stove captures a substantial portion of that heat and releases it into your living space. Benjamin Franklin, that inventor of seemingly everything useful in colonial America, developed an early version of this concept in the 1740s. The Franklin stove, as it came to be called, sat in front of the fireplace opening and used an ingenious baffle system to circulate heat before it escaped up the chimney. Franklin's design had limitations and never achieved the market dominance he hoped for, but it established principles that later inventors refined into the stoves that would eventually transform American heating. Here is detail that speaks to the practical impact of this technology. A family that switched from open fireplace to cast iron stove could reduce their firewood consumption by half or more while actually achieving warmer interior temperatures. The mathematics were compelling. Cutting, splitting, hauling and stacking half as much wood meant hundreds of hours of labour saved annually. More wood available to sell or trade meant additional income. A warmer house meant healthier family members, higher productivity and greater comfort. The initial investment in a stove paid dividends that compounded year after year. The potbelly stove became an icon of 19th century American life, its rounded shape instantly recognisable, its constant presence in general stores, schoolrooms, railroad stations, and increasingly in private homes. The name came from its bulging middle section, which provided maximum surface area for heat radiation. You fed it through a door in front, controlled airflow through adjustable dampers, and let the cast iron do its work of absorbing heat from the fire and releasing it into the surrounding air. Cook stoves represented another evolution, combining heating function with cooking capability in a single integrated unit. Instead of managing pots hung over open flames, a cook stove provided flat iron surfaces at various temperatures where you could set pans directly. An oven compartment built into the stove body allowed baking without the complexity of Dutch ovens or separate bake ovens. The cook stove became the centerpiece of the kitchen, a multifunction device that simplified and improved food preparation while also contributing to home heating. Historians still argue about the pace at which stoves replaced open fireplaces across different regions and economic classes. The evidence suggests that adoption was uneven, with wealthier families and urban households embracing the technology earlier, while poorer families and rural homesteads continued using fireplaces for decades after stoves became available. Cost was a barrier. A good cast iron stove represented a substantial investment, and infrastructure was another, as stoves required different chimney configurations than traditional fireplaces. The transition from fireplace to stove also required learning new skills. Managing a contained fire behaved differently than managing an open one. The damper controls that regulated airflow were crucial to efficient operation but needed to be understood and adjusted properly. Overheating a stove could damage the metal. Underheating it wasted fuel and failed to warm the room. The experienced stove operator developed an intuitive relationship with the device, knowing from sounds and sensations when adjustments were needed. The social dynamics of the heated room changed as well. The fireplace had created a focused gathering point where everyone faced the same direction, toward the flames. The stove radiated heat in all directions, allowing more flexible furniture arrangements and social configurations. The conversation that had necessarily happened facing the fire could now happen facing each other, with the stove as a central heat source, but not an exclusive focal point. The danger profile also shifted. Stoves were hot to the touch, their entire purpose was to radiate heat, and burns from accidental contact were common. Children especially needed to be taught to respect the hot surfaces, and many learned through painful experience. The risk of house fire was reduced in some ways, since fires contained within metal boxes were less likely to throw sparks or spread unexpectedly, but increased in others, as improperly installed or maintained stoves could start chimney fires or ignite nearby combustible materials. The arrival of the stove in a household was often marked as a significant event, remembered and recounted in later years. Families who had endured winters with only open fireplaces experienced the improvement as genuinely transformative. The comfort they had never expected, the reduced labour, the warmer waking temperatures on winter mornings. These changes affected quality of life in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective where such warmth is taken for granted. As you continue through this winter journey, remember that the stove represents a turning point, a moment when technology began to swing the balance between human comfort and winter's assault. The fireplace era was fading, the stove era was beginning, and eventually central heating would arrive to make even stoves seem primitive. But in the 1800s, the cast iron stove was as revolutionary as anything could be. The winter you experience depends enormously on where you live, and the strategies that keep families alive in Massachusetts would be inadequate or unnecessary in South Carolina. America stretches across a vast range of climates, and the regional differences in winter survival are as dramatic as the differences between summer landscapes. Understanding your specific geography is essential to understanding your specific challenges, and what works in one place might be irrelevant or even counterproductive in another. The Northeast, New England and the mid-Atlantic states faces winters of legendary severity. Temperatures drop below zero regularly, snow accumulates in drifts that can reach the rooftops of low buildings, and the cold persists for months at a stretch without meaningful relief. This is the landscape where American cold survival traditions were most intensively developed, where the technologies and practices we have been discussing were refined through generations of bitter experience. If you are imagining the quintessential 19th century winter struggle, you're probably imagining this region. Here, the preparations begin early, and the requirements are absolute. 30 cords of firewood is not an excessive estimate. Insulation, such as it is, matters critically. The livestock must be sheltered from conditions that would kill them quickly if left exposed. Food preservation must account for months of frozen ground and unavailable fresh provisions. The families that thrive in New England winters are those who have internalized these requirements so deeply that the preparations feel like natural seasonal rhythms rather than emergency measures. Move south, and the picture changes considerably. The winters of Virginia, the Carolinas and Georgia are milder. Temperatures rarely drop as low, snow is less common and less persistent, and the total heating season is shorter. But mild does not mean easy. Families in these regions often had lighter construction, fewer heating preparations, and less accumulated cold survival wisdom than their northern counterparts. When cold snaps did arrive, and they did, sometimes bringing temperatures that rivaled northern states, these families were often caught less prepared. Here is a quirky detail that illustrates regional differences. The phrase, "cold enough to freeze the balls off a brass monkey," is sometimes attributed to southern origins, supposedly reflecting the relative rarity and memorability of truly severe cold in warmer regions. Historians dispute this etymology, but the sentiment captures something real. Cold in the south was notable precisely because it was less expected. The Midwest presented its own challenges, combining northern-level temperatures with geographic features that amplified winter's effects. The Great Plains lacked the forest that provided both fuel and windbreaks in eastern regions, leaving settlers exposed to winds that swept unimpeded across thousands of miles. The blue norther storms that could drop temperatures 30 or 40 degrees in a matter of hours caught people outdoors and killed them before they could reach shelter. The soddy homes that substituted for log cabins in treeless regions had their own advantages and disadvantages, but either way, surviving a plains winter required adaptation specific to that environment. Historians still argue about how quickly settlers from other regions adapted their practices to new environments, and how much unnecessary suffering resulted from applying inappropriate strategies to unfamiliar conditions. Eastern families moving west brought assumptions shaped by forested landscapes. Southern families moving north brought expectations of milder weather. The learning curve could be deadly, and the graves of those who failed to adapt quickly enough dot the American landscape. The mountain regions, the Appalachians, the Rockies and their various ranges, created microclimates that could vary dramatically over short distances. Valley bottoms collected cold air and could be significantly colder than hillsides just a few hundred feet higher. Elevation increased cold severity in general, with each 1,000 feet of altitude corresponding roughly to a degree or more of temperature drop. Mining communities, settled in locations chosen for mineral wealth rather than livability, often faced brutal conditions that would never have attracted agricultural settlement. Water's behaviour differed by region as well. In northern areas, rivers and lakes froze solid enough to support heavy traffic, creating winter transportation routes that replaced impassable roads. The ice harvest, which we will discuss later, was a northern industry made possible by reliably thick ice formation. In southern areas, water rarely froze beyond thin surface crusts, and the ice harvest never developed as a significant industry. The rhythm of seasons varied by latitude. In the far north, winter darkness extended the night to 16 hours or more, while summer brought correspondingly long days. In the south, the seasonal variation was less extreme, with more balanced daylight hours year-round. This affected everything from the timing of daily activities to the psychological experience of the season, with northern winters bringing a darkness that southerners never fully experienced. Cultural adaptations reflected these regional differences. New England developed traditions around winter gatherings that helped people endure long confinement. Church meetings, quilting bees, town hall gatherings that brought isolated families together despite difficult travel. Southern winters, being shorter and less severe, did not generate the same intensity of indoor social traditions. Midwestern farm families, spread across larger distances with fewer established communities, faced isolation that neither eastern nor southern families typically experienced. Your survival strategies must be calibrated to your specific geography, and the wisdom that applies in one region may be useless in another. This is why the oral traditions passed down through families were so valuable. They encoded generations of locally adapted knowledge that no general manual could capture. Long before European settlers arrived on this continent, the people who lived here had already solved the problem of winter survival, not perfectly, not without hardship, but with accumulated wisdom spanning thousands of years. Native American peoples across the diverse climates of North America developed strategies for enduring cold that ranged from ingenious to elegant, and the settlers who paid attention to these methods often fared better than those who insisted on doing things their own way. The indigenous peoples of the Northeast had perhaps the most to teach about surviving conditions similar to those European settlers would face. Tribes like the Iroquois, the Abenaki, and the Wampanoag had developed housing, clothing, food preservation, and social organization specifically adapted to harsh winters. Their longhouses and wigwams, constructed with materials and techniques refined over generations, provided shelter that was in some ways superior to the cabins hastily thrown together by newcomers unfamiliar with the land. Wigwams and longhouses used bark, bent saplings, and other materials to create structures with surprisingly effective insulation. The rounded or domed shapes minimized surface area relative to enclosed volume, reducing heat loss. Multiple layers of bark and woven mats created dead air spaces that trapped warmth. Central fire pits with smoke holes designed to draw properly allowed heating without the drafts that plagued European-style fireplaces. When settlers adopted these construction principles, and some did, their comfort improved noticeably. Here is a detail that speaks to the sophistication of indigenous cold weather technology. The designs for cold weather clothing developed by northern peoples were so effective that European explorers and traders adopted them wholesale whenever possible. Moccasins lined with fur, parkas with hoods, mittens made from the right combination of materials. These were not primitive solutions, but refined technologies that represented centuries of optimization for specific environmental conditions. Food preservation and storage among Native Americans included techniques that settlers rarely mastered as effectively. Pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries, provided portable, long-lasting nutrition that could sustain people through months when fresh food was unavailable. Underground storage pits, designed to take advantage of the Earth's relatively stable temperatures, kept food supplies safe from both freezing and spoilage in ways that settlers' above-ground storage often failed to achieve. Historians still argue about the extent to which European settlers learned from indigenous peoples versus developing their own parallel solutions to winter challenges. The evidence suggests a complicated picture. Some settlers actively sought out and adopted Native American techniques. Others learned through observation without acknowledgement. Others rejected indigenous methods out of cultural prejudice, and still others remained ignorant of better practices that were available nearby. The seasonal mobility that characterized many indigenous societies was itself a cold weather strategy that sedentary settlers rarely employed. Moving to different locations at different times of year allowed native peoples to take advantage of varied food sources, sheltered valleys, and other geographic features that made winter more survivable. Settlers who committed to permanent homesteads on fixed plots of land gave up this flexibility, sometimes to their significant disadvantage. The social organization of indigenous communities also provided winter survival advantages. Extended family networks, traditions of mutual aid, and cultural norms around sharing resources created resilience that isolated nuclear families on individual homesteads could not match. When one family's food stores ran low, obligations of kinship and community ensured assistance. When labour was needed for winter tasks, collective effort was available. This social infrastructure was as important to survival as any physical technology. The relationship between settlers and indigenous peoples during winter months was often more cooperative than the broader narrative of conflict might suggest. Trading relationships brought furs, food, and expertise from native communities to settler communities, and brought European goods in return. In some areas, these trading connections were essential to settler survival, particularly in early years before farms were fully established. The boundaries between communities were more permeable than simple categories of settler and indigenous might imply. But the relationship was also fundamentally unequal, with settlers taking more than they gave and indigenous peoples losing more than they gained. The lands on which settlers built their homesteads were lands from which native peoples had been displaced, through treaty, purchase, fraud, or violence. The resources that settlers harvested, timber for cabins and firewood, game for food and furs, were resources that native peoples had managed sustainably for generations. The tragedy of this displacement was playing out continuously throughout the 19th century, even as individual settlers and native individuals sometimes helped each other through difficult winters. The wisdom that indigenous peoples had developed over millennia was often lost or ignored rather than incorporated into American practice. Settlers brought their own assumptions about the right way to build, dress, eat, and organize their lives, and these assumptions were reinforced by cultural prejudices that dismissed Native American practices as inferior. The result was unnecessary suffering, settlers dying of cold while better solutions existed nearby, families struggling with problems that had already been solved by people they refused to learn from. This loss of knowledge is one of the great what-ifs of American history. What if settlers had approached indigenous peoples as teachers rather than obstacles? What if the sophisticated cold weather technologies developed over thousands of years had been systematically adopted rather than sporadically borrowed? The winters would have been no less cold, but the suffering would have been considerably less. The city winter is its own particular nightmare, different in character from rural hardship, but no less deadly. As American urban populations grow throughout the 19th century, concentrated masses of people face cold weather challenges that farm families never encounter, while also lacking some of the survival resources that rural life provides. The urban poor, especially, inhabit a world where cold can kill just as surely as it does on the frontier, but where the tools of survival are harder to obtain and the margin for error is even thinner. The tenement buildings that house immigrant families and the working poor in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were designed for maximum profit rather than maximum livability. Landlords crammed as many rental units as possible into each building, creating warrens of small rooms with minimal light, inadequate ventilation, and almost no heating infrastructure. A single stove might serve an entire floor of apartments, with families taking turns using it or sharing the heat that radiated through thin walls. Many units had no dedicated heating at all, leaving residents to fend for themselves with portable stoves, charcoal braziers, or simply body heat and blankets. Here is a detail that illustrates the desperation. Families in unheated tenement rooms sometimes burned furniture, floorboards, and structural elements of their own buildings to generate warmth. When you have no fuel and no money to buy fuel, you burn whatever will burn, even if it means destroying the very shelter that protects you from the elements. Landlords complained about the damage. Residents replied, not unreasonably, that death from cold seemed worse than eviction for property destruction. Coal was the heating fuel of urban areas, preferred over wood because it provided more heat per unit volume and was easier to transport and store in crowded neighbourhoods. But coal cost money, and when that money was not available, coal was not available. The price of coal rose as winter deepened and demand increased, creating a cruel economics where the coldest weather brought the highest prices, and those least able to afford fuel needed it most desperately. The urban coal supply chain was itself vulnerable to disruption. Coal came from mines in Pennsylvania and other regions, transported by canal and railroad to urban markets. Bad weather could interrupt transportation, mine accidents could reduce production, and labour disputes could halt distribution. Urban residents experienced these supply fluctuations as sudden shortages and price spikes that could make heating fuel effectively unavailable just when it was most needed. Historians still argue about the death toll of urban winter cold, but the evidence of contemporaneous accounts suggests it was substantial. Bodies found in unheated rooms, people dying in the streets from exposure, children succumbing to respiratory infections in overcrowded and poorly ventilated living spaces, These were regular occurrences that newspapers reported and charitable organisations struggled to address. The anonymity of city life meant many such deaths went unrecorded, making any precise count impossible. The class divide in urban winter comfort was stark and visible. Wealthy families lived in well-constructed homes with multiple fireplaces, employed servants to maintain fires through the night, and never wanted for fuel regardless of market prices. They wore quality clothing, ate nutritious food, and had access to medical care when illness struck. Their winter experience, while not as comfortable as modern heating provides, was manageable and survivable. The gap between their comfort and the misery of the poor, often visible across the distance of a single city block, was a source of social tension throughout the era. Charitable organisations attempted to fill some of the gaps that market forces created. Churches, benevolent societies, and early charitable institutions organised coal distributions for the needy, clothing drives, and soup kitchens that provided warm food to those who could not cook for themselves. These efforts saved lives, but they were insufficient to address the scale of the problem. The recipients of charity were those lucky enough to meet eligibility requirements, fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time, or connected enough to know that help was available. The indoor life of urban winter differed from rural winter in its density and its public quality. Tenement residents could not retreat into the privacy of their own homesteads, because privacy barely existed in their living conditions. Multiple families sharing single rooms, children of different families playing together in cramped spaces, the sounds and smells of neighbours penetrating thin walls. This created a winter experience that was communal whether people wanted it to be or not. Public spaces took on new importance during urban winters. Saloons provided warmth to those who could afford a drink, and sometimes to those who could not, offering a heated room as an implicit part of the transaction. Churches opened their doors for services that also served as warming opportunities. Libraries, where they existed, became refuges for people seeking heat as much as books. The struggle to stay warm became a constant search for any space where warmth might be found. The urban poor developed their own survival strategies, many of which would be familiar to homeless populations today. Sharing body heat in crowded spaces, seeking out steam vents and other sources of waste heat, learning which public buildings were warmest and most tolerant of loitering, creating makeshift shelters in doorways and alleys. These adaptive behaviours represented ingenuity in the face of terrible circumstances, but they were also markers of a society that failed to provide basic survival resources to all its members. Not everyone suffered during American winters. Wealth provided insulation from cold in multiple senses of the word, and the experience of winter among the prosperous was as different from the experience of the poor as anything in 19th century life. Understanding how the wealthy stayed warm illuminates the possibilities that existed and throws into sharper relief the deprivations that most Americans endured. Comfort was achievable in this era. It simply was not achievable by everyone. The homes of wealthy Americans were constructed to different standards than the cabins and tenements where ordinary people shivered. Multiple rooms with multiple fireplaces allowed heat distribution throughout the structure rather than concentration in a single area. Better construction techniques, higher quality materials, and more generous budgets produced walls that actually resisted drafts, windows that actually blocked cold air, and roofs that actually kept out precipitation. The wealthy did not battle the cold from within barely adequate shelters. They occupied homes designed for comfort from the ground up. Servants made a crucial difference. A wealthy household employed staff whose responsibilities included maintaining fires around the clock. The early morning task of rebuilding fires fell to servants who rose before the family, ensuring that employers woke to rooms already warmed rather than to the frozen conditions that greeted most Americans. Fires were tended through the night, fuel was replenished, ashes were removed, and all the labour of heat maintenance was performed by hired hands rather than family members. Here is a detail that captures the luxury divide. Some wealthy homes featured warming systems for the bedding that went far beyond the simple bed warmers available to ordinary families. Servants would heat not just the sheets but the entire bedchamber to comfortable temperatures before the family retired, sometimes using multiple warming devices or even early versions of heated air distribution. The concept of a cold bed was simply not part of wealthy winter experience in the same way. Clothing for the wealthy included materials that most Americans never touched. Fine merino wool, soft and warm without the itchiness of coarser fibres. Imported silk underlayers. fur coats, muffs and hats made from the choicest pelts rather than whatever could be trapped locally. The wealthy were dressed by tailors who understood how to construct garments for both style and warmth, and their wardrobes contained specialised items for different winter occasions. A wealthy woman might own a fur-lined coat for outdoor excursions, a lighter wool wrap for carriage rides, and an elegant but warm house dress for indoor wear. A level of wardrobe specialisation impossible for families who struggle to keep everyone minimally clothed. Food for wealthy tables included fresh items that preserved their availability despite the season. Wealthy families could afford to import foods from warmer climates, extending the variety of their diet beyond what local preservation could provide. Hothouse cultivation, growing plants in heated glass structures, provided fresh vegetables to those who could maintain such expensive infrastructure. The wealthy did not eat salt pork and turnips all winter. They ate roasted meats, varied vegetables and desserts made from sugar and preserved fruits that ordinary families experienced only on special occasions if at all. Historians still argue about how aware the wealthy were of the suffering that cold caused among the less fortunate, and how much responsibility they felt for addressing that suffering. Some wealthy families were active in charitable efforts, organising coal distributions, funding soup kitchens, and supporting institutions that served the poor. Others maintained comfortable ignorance, insulated from the worst effects of winter poverty by the same wealth that insulated them from cold. The moral response to inequality varied by individual character, religious conviction, and social pressure. Medical care also differentiated the winter experience by class. Wealthy families had access to physicians, however limited the effectiveness of 19th century medicine might have been. They could afford medications, rest and nursing care that gave their bodies the best chance of fighting off winter illnesses. They could maintain the nutrition and warmth that supported immune function. The wealthy got sick in winter too, but their odds of recovery were substantially better than those of the poor. Transportation during winter months was easier for the wealthy, who owned horses, carriages and later, the resources to hire cabs or take advantage of whatever public transportation existed. The wealthy could reach their destinations without long walks through snow and cold, could travel in enclosed vehicles that blocked wind, and could time their journeys to avoid the worst weather rather than being forced out regardless of conditions. The poor walked everywhere, in whatever they could afford to wear, through whatever the weather brought. The psychological experience of winter differed as well. The wealthy could enjoy winter, taking pleasure in snow scenes, sledding excursions, ice skating and other cold weather recreations that require security against the underlying threats of the season. When survival is not in question, cold weather can be beautiful and stimulating rather than simply threatening. The cosy appeal of a warm room with frost on the windows outside is a pleasure available only to those who have no doubt about their ability to maintain that warmth. This stark inequality was not hidden from public view. The contrasts between rich and poor were obvious to anyone who moved through American cities and towns. The political and social implications of these contrasts would fuel reform movements throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But for most of the 1800s, the inequality of winter comfort was simply accepted as the natural order of things. Survival through American winters was never purely an individual or family matter. It was a community effort, sometimes explicitly organised, and sometimes simply the natural result of people depending on each other in hard times. The networks of neighbours, churches, extended families, and local institutions that helped people through the coldest months represented a form of social infrastructure that was as essential to survival as any physical technology. To be alone in winter was to be in danger. To be embedded in community was to have a fighting chance. The barn raising is perhaps the most iconic image of 19th century American community cooperation, but it represents just one example of a much broader pattern of mutual aid that characterized rural life. Neighbors helped neighbors with major tasks throughout the year, and this cooperation intensified during the seasons when failure could mean death. When a family's wood supply ran dangerously low, neighbors might share from their own stores or contribute labor to cut and split more. When illness struck and farm chores went undone, neighbors stepped in to care for animals and maintain essential functions. Here is a detail that illuminates how this cooperation worked. Many communities had informal but well-understood expectations about who would help whom and what kinds of assistance were appropriate. These expectations were reinforced by reciprocity. You helped your neighbours because you knew you might need their help someday, and because failing to help would mark you as someone who could not be relied upon. Social reputation and practical survival were intertwined in ways that encouraged cooperation even among people who might not have chosen to be friends. Churches served as organising institutions for winter mutual aid in ways that went beyond their spiritual functions. Religious communities brought people together regularly throughout winter months, providing opportunities for information sharing, need identification, and coordination of assistance. Ministers often knew which families were struggling and could quietly arrange help from those with resources to spare. The church building itself provided a heated public space for gatherings that served social as well as religious purposes. Quilting bees, which we discussed earlier, were one of many social events that combined productive work with community connection during winter months. Sewing circles, barn dances, spelling bees, singing gatherings, and various other organised activities brought isolated families together, breaking the monotony of winter confinement, while also reinforcing the social bonds that made mutual aid possible. These gatherings were not luxuries but necessities, maintaining the human connections that survival required. Historians still argue about whether 19th century community cooperation represented genuine altruism or simply self-interested exchange disguised in the language of neighbourliness. The answer is almost certainly both. People helped each other from mixed motives that included genuine care, calculated self-interest, religious obligation, and social pressure. The important point is that the cooperation happened regardless of motivation, creating resilience that individual families could not have achieved alone. Extended family networks provided another layer of winter support. Adult siblings living in proximity, grandparents residing with or near their children's families, cousins and more distant relations maintaining connections across generations. These kinship webs created obligations and opportunities for mutual assistance. A widowed grandmother might move between her children's homes through the winter, contributing labour and wisdom while reducing the burden on any single household. Young men might spend the coldest months helping at a relative's farm in exchange for room and board. The nuclear family was embedded in larger structures that shared resources and risks. The isolation that some families experienced was itself understood as dangerous, and communities developed mechanisms to check on remote households during severe weather. After major storms, neighbours might ski or snowshoe to homesteads that had been cut off, ensuring that residents were alive and had adequate supplies. These welfare checks were acts of genuine kindness, but they were also practical community self-interest. A family that died in isolation became a loss to the entire community, a gap in the network that everyone depended upon. Information sharing was a crucial function of winter community gatherings. Successful techniques for weathering the cold spread through conversation. A better way to bank a fire, a food preservation method that someone had tried successfully, a folk remedy that seemed to help with winter illness. This oral transmission of knowledge meant that community members were not limited to their own experience, but could benefit from the accumulated wisdom of everyone around them. Innovation happened when someone tried something new and it worked. Dissemination happened when they told their neighbours about it. The obligations of community cut both ways, of course. Families that could not meet their responsibilities, that took help without reciprocating, that failed to contribute to collective efforts, that isolated themselves from community life, face social consequences that could make their winters even harder. Being part of a community meant accepting its expectations and conforming to its norms, which was not always easy or pleasant, but the alternative, facing winter alone, was worse. The decline of this community infrastructure in later generations would be one of the great social transformations of American history, as geographic mobility, urbanization, and increasing wealth reduced the practical necessity of mutual aid. Central heating and modern construction made survival less dependent on cooperative effort. People could be more independent because the threats that required interdependence had been reduced. But something was also lost in this transition, a quality of human connection forged in shared hardship that prosperity could not replicate. And the cold that traps you in your home does not merely chill your body, it can freeze your mind, shrinking your world to the dimensions of a single room and the faces of the same people you have seen every day for months. Cabin fever is not just a quaint phrase, but a genuine psychological phenomenon, the product of confinement, monotony, reduced sunlight, and the grinding stress of constant cold management. Surviving winter physically while losing your sanity would hardly count as survival at all, and so the mental battles of the season matter as much as the physical ones. The days are short and the darkness is long. In northern latitudes, during the deepest winter, useful daylight might last only 8 or 9 hours, with the sun rising late and setting early, its arc across the sky so low that it barely clears the horizon. The darkness presses in from both ends of the day, requiring candles or firelight for any activity beyond sleeping. This chronic low-light environment affects mood in ways that modern psychology has documented, but 19th century people experienced without understanding. What we now call seasonal affective disorder was simply part of winter's burden. Its symptoms endured without the terminology to describe them. Here is a detail that speaks to the psychological weight of winter confinement. Some communities recorded dramatic increases in domestic violence, alcohol abuse, and interpersonal conflict during winter months, patterns that modern researchers would attribute to the stress of confined living. Families that functioned well enough in warmer seasons, when members could spend time outdoors and apart from each other, became pressure cookers when cold forced everyone into the same small space, hour after hour, day after day, week after week. The boredom was relentless. Modern people, with instant access to global entertainment through devices in their pockets, can barely imagine the entertainment scarcity of 19th century winter life. There was no television, no radio, no recorded music, no internet, no video games, no streaming services. If you were lucky, you had books. But many families owned few, if any, books beyond a Bible and perhaps an almanac. If you were very lucky, someone in your household could play a musical instrument. If you were unlucky, you had nothing but conversation, and the supply of things to say to people you'd been talking to for months could run thin. Work provided structure and purpose, but work also exhausted. The endless demands of fire maintenance, animal care, food preparation, and household upkeep left little energy for recreation, even when time allowed. The rhythm of labour that defined agricultural life continued through winter, modified by season but never truly relaxing. People did not suffer from boredom because they had nothing to do. They had plenty to do, but from the monotonous sameness of what they had to do, the repetitive cycle of tasks that followed each other in unchanging sequence. Historians still argue about how 19th century Americans maintained their mental health through winter confinement, with some emphasizing religious faith, others community connection, others the satisfaction of meaningful work, and still others suggesting that mental health as we conceptualize it today was simply a less central concern for people whose primary focus was physical survival. Children needed particular attention to prevent winter from becoming a season of stunted development. Creative parents invented games, told stories, assigned projects, and found ways to maintain the stimulation that growing minds required. Education could continue through winter if resources allowed. Teaching children to read, write, and cipher kept their minds active while preparing them for productive adult life. Families that treated winter as a season of learning emerged in spring with children who had gained skills. Families that simply let children languish emerged with children who had lost ground. Small entertainments became disproportionately important. A new story told by a travelling visitor, a letter received from distant relatives, a special meal prepared to break the monotony of winter fare, a successful hunt that brought variety to the table. These minor events punctuated the sameness of winter days, providing something to look forward to and something to remember. The anticipation of Christmas, New Year's, or other winter celebrations gave structure to otherwise featureless months, creating horizons toward which one could direct one's attention. Personal projects offered another outlet for minds that might otherwise turn destructive. Women's needlework, knitting, quilting, embroidery, provided both useful products and mental occupation. Men's workshop projects, carving, repairing tools, building furniture, served similar purposes. Children assigned to spin wool or practice penmanship were being given work that would keep their hands busy and their minds focused, staving off the idleness that seemed to invite trouble. The phrase, "idle hands are the devil's workshop," was not just moral instruction, but practical wisdom about the psychological dangers of having nothing to do. The temptation to self-medicate through alcohol was constant, and alcohol was widely available even in remote areas. Drinking provided temporary warmth, temporary relief from boredom, and temporary escape from the close confines of winter life. But drinking also led to impaired judgment, family conflict, reduced capacity for the work that survival required, and sometimes tragedy. The temperance movement that would become a major force in American life had its roots in part in observations about what alcohol did to families trapped together through long winters. Coming through winter with your mind intact was an achievement worth noting, and the arrival of spring brought psychological renewal as much as seasonal relief. The end of winter does not arrive as a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual loosening, a slowly increasing warmth that advances and retreats in unpredictable waves. Spring teases before it delivers, and the psychological torture of near thaw followed by freezing relapse can be almost as difficult as deep winter's stable cold. But eventually, inevitably, the season turns, and the long struggle begins to yield to something that feels almost like hope. The first signs are subtle, days that feel slightly warmer, even though temperatures have not changed dramatically, sunlight that seems to have more strength, melting snow on south-facing surfaces, while shaded areas remain frozen. The sound of water dripping from icicles during the warmest part of the day, only to freeze again overnight. These early hints trigger anticipation that can become almost painful. The desire for winter to end intensifies precisely as the end approaches. Here is something that 19th century Americans understood viscerally. Late-season storms could be among the most dangerous of the year. The infamous March lion, bringing one last blast of winter, could catch people who had begun to relax their vigilance, who had allowed their wood supplies to dwindle, who had stopped treating cold as the mortal threat it remained. Many deaths occurred in spring storms that should not have been lethal, suffered by people who had successfully survived the worst of winter only to falter at the finish line. The thawing process created practical problems that extended the season's difficulties. Frozen ground that had been passable became muddy quagmire. Roads that were merely cold became impassable bogs. The freeze-thaw cycle that repeated daily through this transition period was hard on everything. Buildings, roads, equipment, animals, humans. March and early April could feel almost as confining as January, with the additional frustration of visible spring within reach but not yet graspable. Snowmelt meant water, and water in quantities that could overwhelm systems designed to handle it. Streams flooded their banks. Cellars flooded. Fields became temporary ponds. The infrastructure of water management, ditches, drains and channels, that modern development provides was largely absent in the 19th century, leaving people to cope with seasonal flooding as an inevitable part of spring's arrival. Items stored near ground level had to be elevated or moved. Animals had to be relocated to higher ground. Travel plans had to account for impassable waterways. Historians still argue about how 19th century Americans experienced the transition from winter to spring psychologically, whether relief was the dominant emotion or whether the demands of spring planting and recovery work created their own stress that blunted any celebration. The evidence suggests both. People were genuinely glad to emerge from winter's grip, and they were also immediately busy with accumulated work that had waited for warmer weather. The first outdoor activities of spring carried special significance. Children playing outside without heavy clothing for the first time in months. Adults taking walks that were not merely necessary trips between buildings, but actual leisure excursions enjoyed for their own sake. The sensory experience of the world waking up, birds returning, early flowers blooming, the smell of warming earth, provided pleasure that had been impossible during the frozen months. Recovery work began immediately and proceeded urgently. Buildings that had been damaged by winter weather needed repair. Fences that had been knocked down by snow or wind needed rebuilding. Animals that had been confined needed space to range. Equipment that had been stored needed preparation for the coming season's use. The pause that winter represented, time taken from productive agricultural work, had to be compensated for through intensive spring labour. For those who had lost family members during winter, spring brought the possibility of proper burial. Graves that could not be dug in frozen ground were finally dug in thawing soil, and services that had been delayed could finally be held. The grief that had accumulated through the confined months found its formal expression in funeral rituals that marked both personal loss and seasonal transition. The dead of winter were literally buried as spring arrived. The taking stock that occurred in early spring revealed the full cost of the season past. How much of the wood supply remained? How much preserved food? How had livestock fared? How many survived? How many did not? What repairs were needed? What replacements acquired? What work caught up? These inventories sometimes showed that families had come through in better shape than feared. Other times, They revealed deficits that would complicate the coming year. Spring planting waited for no one who was still exhausted from winter, and the agricultural calendar began its acceleration almost before snow had fully melted. The respite between seasons was brief, and those who could not pivot quickly from winter survival mode to spring production mode fell behind in ways that could cascade through the entire year. There was no vacation, no recovery period, no slow re-entry into normal life. Winter ended and spring began, and the demand simply changed rather than decreased. But the warmth was real. The lengthening days were real. The weight of winter lifted gradually but perceptibly, and though the work remained hard, it no longer included the constant battle against cold that had coloured every action for months. That alone was cause for gratitude. We live in a world so thoroughly transformed by technology that the survival skills of 2 centuries ago have largely vanished from common knowledge. The furnace clicks on automatically when your thermostat detects a temperature drop. You have never needed to know how to bank a fire. The grocery store stocks fresh vegetables year-round. You have never needed to master food preservation. Your home was built to meet modern insulation standards. You have never needed to spend autumn chinking gaps between logs. This is progress, unmistakably, but something has also been lost. The knowledge that sustained generations of Americans through harsh winters exists now primarily in historical records, craft revival movements, and isolated communities that have intentionally preserved older ways. Most people could not survive a 19th century winter if transported back in time, lacking not just the physical infrastructure but the skills, knowledge, and psychological preparation that their ancestors possessed. We are adapted to our environment just as they were adapted to theirs, but our environment has changed so dramatically that the old adaptations have become irrelevant. Here is a detail that captures this loss. The number of people who can successfully start a fire using nothing but matches, kindling, and firewood without newspaper, lighter fluid, or other modern accelerants is surprisingly small. This skill, which was universal knowledge for our ancestors, has become specialised expertise possessed primarily by campers, survivalists, and craft enthusiasts. The basic competency that separated the living from the dead in earlier eras is now a hobby interest. Some of the lost skills would be useful to recover. Food preservation techniques that do not require electricity, canning, smoking, salting, root cellaring, represent knowledge that could matter in emergencies or for those seeking more self-sufficient lifestyles. Basic carpentry skills, once universal among rural men, have become professional specializations. Textile skills, spinning, weaving, knitting, quilting, that were essential to providing clothing and bedding, are now craft hobbies or industrial processes. Each of these skills represented capability that families once possessed and have now outsourced. The psychological resilience that winter demanded has also faded as winters have become gentler experiences. Modern Americans can go entire winters without meaningful cold exposure, moving from heated home to heated car to heated workplace in continuous climate-controlled comfort. The mental toughness required to endure months of genuine hardship, the patience to wait out difficult circumstances without complaint, the community solidarity forged through shared struggle. These qualities have fewer opportunities for development when the struggles they developed from have been eliminated. Historians still argue about whether the skills and qualities lost to modernization matter beyond nostalgia, or whether they represent capabilities that truly have no further application. The answer probably depends on circumstances. For those living in developed urban areas with reliable infrastructure, the old skills may indeed be curiosities without practical relevance. For those in vulnerable circumstances, areas prone to power outages, regions facing economic instability, individuals committed to self-sufficient lifestyles, the old knowledge retains genuine value. Climate change adds another dimension to this consideration. The weather patterns that our infrastructure was built to handle are shifting in unpredictable ways. The cold snaps that occasionally disable power grids remind us that central heating depends on complex systems that can fail. The supply chain disruptions that periodically empty grocery shelves remind us that food security depends on networks we do not control. The skills our ancestors used to survive without these systems might become relevant again in ways we cannot fully anticipate. Teaching these skills, to children, to interested adults, to anyone who wishes to learn, has value that extends beyond practical application. Understanding how people survived before modern conveniences creates appreciation for what we have now. Learning the effort required for basic survival puts our complaints about minor discomforts in perspective. Connecting with ancestral knowledge provides a sense of continuity across generations that purely contemporary education cannot offer. The craft revival movements that have emerged in recent decades represent one form of this reconnection. People learning to knit, to preserve food, to work with wood, to raise small livestock. They are reclaiming capabilities that their great-grandparents would have considered basic. The motivation is often as much meaning as utility. People find satisfaction in creating what they could more easily purchase, in understanding processes that have been rendered invisible by industrialization. Whether these skills will ever be needed for survival, they enrich the lives of those who possess them. The ultimate lesson from the winter survival practices of earlier eras might be humility. Our ancestors were not simple people living simple lives. They were sophisticated problem solvers deploying accumulated wisdom to address challenges that would overwhelm most of us today. They knew things we have forgotten, and they could do things we cannot do. The progress that has freed us from their hardships has also made us dependent on systems they never needed. We should be grateful for what we have while remaining aware of what we have lost. The images that come to mind when we think of 19th century American winters are often touched by nostalgia, softened by distance, romanticized by time's passage. The Currier and Ives prints, the Norman Rockwell sensibilities applied retroactively, the cosy cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. These familiar pictures obscure realities that were far less charming. Separating mythology from history matters because mythology can prevent us from understanding what actually happened and why it matters. The mythological version of Winter Past features happy families gathered around roaring fires, children playing joyfully in pristine snow, and hardy pioneers facing challenges with cheerful determination. This version acknowledges difficulty but frames it as character building rather than genuinely dangerous. It suggests that people were tougher then, more resourceful, more connected to the land and to each other, and that we have lost something important in our transition to modern comfort. Here is what the mythology leaves out: the frozen corpses, the amputated limbs, the babies who did not survive their first winter, the families who starved when supplies ran out, the fires that killed entire households, the isolation that drove people to madness, the diseases that spread through confined spaces, the grinding poverty that made every winter a calculation of who might not survive. The past was not a simpler time, it was a deadlier time, and the people who lived through it were not more virtuous than we are, but simply faced with fewer options. The "they were tougher then" narrative deserves particular scrutiny. Were 19th century Americans actually more physically and psychologically resilient than modern Americans? The evidence is mixed at best. They endured more, certainly, but endurance under duress is not the same as superior toughness. Many people did not endure. They died, or suffered permanent damage, or were broken by experiences that they had no choice but to face. The survivors were not necessarily tougher than the victims, they were often simply luckier. Historians still argue about how to balance accurate representation of historical hardship against the risk of presentism, judging the past by the standards of the present in ways that distort understanding. The goal should be neither romanticization nor condemnation, but simply accuracy. People lived as they could, using the resources available to them within the constraints imposed by their circumstances. They did the best they could, and their best was sometimes remarkable and sometimes inadequate. The frontier cabin as icon represents particularly troublesome mythology. These structures were often temporary expedients, built quickly with the intention of replacement once circumstances allowed. They were not charming retreats from modern complexity, but barely adequate shelters that people lived in because they had no alternative. The romanticization of cabin life overlooks the urgent desire most cabin dwellers had to improve their circumstances as soon as possible. Similarly, the mythology of self-sufficiency obscures the reality of interdependence. The rugged individualist, making it alone against the wilderness, is largely a fictional creation. Real frontier families depended on neighbours, communities, trading networks, and wider social structures that the individualist mythology ignores. The people who actually tried to go it alone often died alone. Survival required connection. The suffering of marginalised groups is particularly poorly served by romantic mythology. The experiences of the urban poor, of recent immigrants, of indigenous peoples displaced from their lands, of enslaved people in whatever conditions their enslavers provided. These experiences do not fit the cheerful cabin narrative, and are therefore often omitted from popular understanding. The winter was hardest for those with the fewest resources, and their hardships deserve acknowledgement rather than erasure. Understanding the past accurately serves multiple purposes. It provides appropriate gratitude for the improvements that have occurred, the progress that means we need not fear winter as our ancestors did. It provides perspective on our complaints, the minor inconveniences that seem significant until compared with genuine hardship. And it provides knowledge that might actually be useful, insights from how people coped that could inform our own responses to challenges we have not yet faced. The truth about 19th century American winters is that they were genuinely difficult, that people genuinely suffered, that many people died who should not have died, and that the survivors managed through a combination of skill, community, and luck. This truth is not as comfortable as mythology, but it has the virtue of being true, and now, as this long winter journey draws toward its close, you find yourself drifting somewhere between the frozen past and your warm present, between the howling winds outside 19th century cabins and the gentle hum of modern heating systems, between the survival struggles of those who came before and the comfortable security of everything you take for granted. The fire in your imagined hearth burns low, but it is a contented kind of low, the embers settling into their overnight rest, the warmth still radiating gently into a room that has been warm for hours. You have travelled through months of cold in the space of this conversation, experiencing in imagination what your ancestors experienced in bone and blood. You have felt the frost on the inside of cabin walls, the weight of wool blankets piled high, the heat of the fire against your face while your back stayed cold. You have struggled with firewood that never seemed to be enough, with water frozen in its bucket, with animals that depended on your care through conditions that made care difficult. You have lost sleep to fire maintenance and shivered through trips to frozen outhouses. You have eaten the same preserved foods until you thought you might never want to see salt pork again. You have watched family members sicken and worried whether they would recover. You have felt the walls close in during dark afternoons that seem to last forever. But you have also found warmth where warmth could be found, in the fire's glow, in quilts heavy with love and labour, in the bodies of family members pressed close through long nights, in the visits of neighbours who trudged through snow to check on your well-being, in the small celebrations that broke the monotony, in the work that gave your days structure and your hands purpose. You have discovered that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of finding contentment even in difficult circumstances, capable of creating community even when conditions encourage isolation, capable of surviving what seems unsurvivable through stubbornness and ingenuity and simple refusal to give up. The spring that finally came to those winter-weary ancestors is coming for you now too, in a different sense. Your journey through this history is ending, and you are emerging back into your modern life, where the thermostat will keep your home warm without effort, where food is available in any season, where clothing is soft and plentiful, where the cold is an inconvenience rather than a threat. You return with new appreciation for what you have, new understanding of what others have endured, new respect for the distance between then and now. The final embers in the imagined hearth glow soft orange, pulsing gently with each breath of air that reaches them. Outside the cabin window, the winter night is still and cold, but inside there is warmth enough. Always warmth enough if you have done the work and made the preparations and accepted the help of those around you. The covers are heavy on your bed, the night is deep, and sleep is pulling you down into its welcoming darkness. Those who survived those winters are your ancestors in one sense or another, the people whose endurance made the world you inhabit possible, whose struggles created the prosperity you enjoy, whose children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren eventually became the society you live in. You carry forward something of their resilience, something of their determination, something of their capacity to endure what must be endured and emerge whole on the other side. Let your breathing slow now, deeper and longer with each passing moment. Let your muscles release the tension they have been holding, the small knots of worry and attention that accumulate through every waking day. Let your thoughts drift like snowflakes falling, each one beautiful and unique and ultimately settling into a peaceful blanket of rest. The fire does not need your attention. The night does not need your vigilance. For now, for this moment, everything is exactly as it should be. The warmth surrounds you. The darkness welcomes you. The journey is complete. Sweet dreams.